The combat dog had his jaws 3 inches from the trauma surgeon's throat when Claire Donovan walked through the door. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The ER at Harlow General Medical Center in Fort Callum, Virginia, had seen bad nights before. This wasn't a bad night. This was a soldier bleeding out on a gurney with 80 pounds of military working dog standing on his chest and 6 trained medical professionals frozen against the wall like they'd forgotten everything they ever learned. Then Claire stepped forward. She didn't run. She didn't call for security. She just walked, slow and steady, and said 2 words. "Easy, Rex." The dog sat down. The room didn't know what to do with that. Neither did Claire. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The blood had been there before Claire noticed it. That was the thing about trauma work. You stopped seeing the blood first and started seeing everything else. The IV lines. The O2 sat. The way a man's chest moved or didn't move. The blood was just context. What wasn't context was the dog. He was a Belgian Malinois, maybe 4 years old, with a tactical vest still buckled across his back and a leash that had been cut clean through, not chewed. Someone had cut it deliberately. The dog had come in with the soldier and hadn't left his side since, which meant somewhere in the last 40 minutes, while the triage team was trying to assess a man with 2 gunshot wounds and a collapsed lung, nobody had managed to move an 80-pound military working dog who clearly had no intention of being moved. Claire had come in on the tail end of a 12-hour shift. She'd been charting at the nurse's station when the radio crackled and the charge nurse, Peggy Adler, stuck her head around the corner with that look. The one that meant something had gone sideways in a way that wasn't covered in any protocol. "Trauma Bay 3, Peggy said. "We've got a situation." That was an understatement. The soldier on the gurney was young, late 20s, maybe 30, with the kind of build that didn't come from a gym and a face that had spent serious time outdoors in bad weather. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, and the combat vest someone had partially cut away from him was soaked through. 2 entry wounds, one high on the left side of the chest, one lower, angled in a way that suggested he'd been moving when he was hit. The exit wounds were worse. He was running out of time. And Rex, because that was the name stenciled on the dog's vest, Rex K9 Unit 7, was standing directly on the man's sternum, not hard enough to cause additional injury, but positioned in a way that made it impossible to get proper access. Every time a doctor or nurse stepped forward, the dog's lip pulled back. Not frantic, not panicked, controlled. He was doing a job. Dr. Marcus Veld was the trauma chief on duty, a tall man in his mid-50s with a reputation for 2 things: efficient surgical technique and an absolute intolerance for anything that slowed him down. He was standing at the foot of the gurney with his arms crossed, which meant he'd already given up on the direct approach and was now calculating who to blame. "Animal control is 15 minutes out," said one of the residents, a young woman named Tasha Briggs, who was pressing herself against the counter and trying to look useful. "He'll be dead in 10, Veld said flatly. "Somebody call the MPs. Get me someone who knows how to handle a military animal." "MPs are en route," said another voice from the doorway. 15 to 20 minutes. That's the same answer. "Yes, sir." Veld looked at the dog. The dog looked at Veld. Neither of them blinked. That was when Claire came through the door. She took in the room in about 3 seconds. The frozen staff, the blood pooling under the gurney, the soldier's color, which was going gray in a way she recognized. And then she looked at Rex, and something in her chest did a thing she hadn't felt in a long time. A kind of recognition. She walked forward. "Donovan?" Peggy said sharply from behind her. "Don't. Easy, Rex." The dog sat, just like that. His ears came forward. His weight shifted back off the soldier's chest. He looked at Claire with an expression that, if you didn't know better, you might have called relief. Claire didn't stop to think about what that meant. She moved to the left side of the gurney, assessed the chest wound in about 4 seconds, and said, without looking up, "He needs a chest tube, right side. The lung's been down for a while. We're losing him." Veld stared at her. "Who are you?" "Claire Donovan. I'm a floor nurse." She was already reaching for gloves. "Do you want to have this conversation now, or do you want to put in the chest tube?" It was the wrong thing to say to Marcus Veld. She knew it when she said it, But the soldier's O2 sat was reading 62%, and there wasn't time for the version of this conversation where she deferred properly and waited for him to reach the same conclusion on his own. Veld's jaw tightened. He looked at the dog, who was now sitting calmly at the side of the gurney with his eyes on Claire, and he made a decision. Not because he respected her assessment, she could see that, but because the numbers on the monitor were saying the same thing she was, and he wasn't going to let a patient die to make a point. "Tube tray," he said to Tasha. "Now." They worked. Claire had learned a long time ago that trauma medicine in a controlled environment was a different animal from trauma medicine in the field. In a hospital, you had a team, you had equipment, you had the luxury of proper lighting and a sterile field. In the field, you had whatever was in your kit and however many seconds you had before the situation changed. What she found, in the years since she'd come back, was that the field experience made the hospital easier. The noise didn't rattle her. The blood didn't rattle her. What rattled her was the politics, the hierarchy, the way a room full of skilled people could lose 10 minutes to a power struggle while a patient coded. She handed instruments before they were asked for. She watched the soldier's pressure, called out the numbers without being prompted, adjusted the O2 flow when his SAT started coming back up. Veld was good. She could see that, underneath the ego, he was technically excellent. And between the two of them, they had the soldier stabilized in under 8 minutes. Not fast enough to be impressive, fast enough to keep him alive. When it was over, Claire stepped back and stripped off her gloves. And that was when Marcus Veld turned to look at her properly for the first time. "Where did you train?" he asked. "Army," she said. It was the shortest true answer. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. Veld didn't do warmth, but a recalibration. He looked at the dog, who had moved to the corner of the bay and was sitting quietly, watching Claire with the focused attention of an animal waiting for a command. "Army doesn't explain that," Veld said. "No," Claire agreed. "It doesn't." She left before he could ask a follow-up question. The soldier's name, according to the ID that one of the MPs eventually pulled from his vest, was Lieutenant James Rourke. Navy. The unit designation on his paperwork was one of those strings of numbers and letters that didn't correspond to anything in the standard military directory, which meant it was either a filing error or it wasn't, and Claire had been around long enough to know which option was more likely. She found out his name the way she found out most things on nights like this, by being present and quiet in places where people talked, which was a skill she'd developed over 12 years of being the kind of person who got overlooked. The MPs arrived in force about 20 minutes after the initial call. 4 of them, which was 3 more than you typically sent for a routine escort. They took up positions outside the trauma bay, spoke quietly among themselves, and made a point of not speaking loudly enough for anyone around them to hear. Claire noted all of it while she restocked the supply cart in the hallway and pretended to be focused on counting gauze packs. Rex had accepted one of the MPs, a compact woman named Flores, according to her name tape, enough to let her attach a temporary leash, but he kept pulling toward the trauma bay door. He wasn't distressed. He was just waiting. The federal agents showed up 40 minutes after that. 2 of them, plain clothes, the kind of plain clothes that was very obviously trying not to look like federal. They spoke with the charge nurse, then with hospital security, then disappeared into an administrative office with the senior MP. Whatever was in Lieutenant Rourke's vest or on his person had elevated this from a routine military medical transfer to something else, something that brought quiet men in dark jackets through an ER entrance at 2 in the morning. Claire finished her shift at 6. She changed in the locker room, pulled on her jacket, and was halfway to the parking garage when Peggy caught up with her. "Veld wants to know your background," Peggy said. "He asked me to pull your file." "Okay." "Claire," Peggy lowered her voice, "what's in your file?" "The parts that aren't classified." Peggy stared at her for a moment, then exhaled through her nose. "You should be more careful." "I know." "That dog knew you." "Dogs are good at reading body language," Claire said. "It's not complicated." It was completely complicated. She drove home in the gray, early morning and sat in her car in the driveway for a while without going inside, because the thing that had happened with Rex, that specific instant recognition, wasn't something she could explain away with body language, and she knew it, and she didn't want to think about what it meant. She hadn't been near a military working dog in 4 years. She'd been very deliberate about that. She was back at Harlow General by noon, not because she was scheduled, but because her phone had rung at 9 with Peggy's number, and Peggy's first words were, "Something happened." Lieutenant Rourke had stabilized overnight. He was in the ICU on the 3rd floor, sedated, with MPS at his door and a federal presence that had expanded from 2 agents to 6. The hospital administrator, a man named Derek Colson, who wore expensive suits and had the handshake of someone who'd been trained to have a good handshake, had set up a temporary conference room on the 2nd floor for the federal team. What had happened, Peggy explained in the parking garage in a voice barely above a murmur, was that someone had attempted to access Rourke's room at 4 in the morning. Not a patient, not a staff member. Someone who had come through a maintenance corridor on the 3rd floor and gotten within 15 feet of the ICU before a security camera caught them, at which point they had turned around and left. The footage showed a figure in a gray jacket with a hat pulled low, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew where the cameras were. The federal agents had the footage. They weren't sharing it with hospital security. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire asked. Peggy looked at her for a long moment. "Because Agent Harlan Tate asked me to find the nurse who handled the dog." Claire was quiet. "He wants to talk to you," Peggy said. "I'm sure he does." "Claire, tell him I'll come in." She was already moving toward the entrance. "Don't tell him anything else about me." Peggy didn't ask why. That was one of the things Claire valued about Peggy Adler. She had a sense for when asking questions would only make things worse, and she respected it. Harlan Tate was not what she expected, which was itself probably the point. He was in his late 40s, medium height, with the unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent a career making himself forgettable. He was sitting at the conference table with a folder in front of him and a coffee cup that looked like it had been there for a while. And when Claire came in, he stood up, not as a courtesy exactly, but as an assessment. "Ms. Donovan," he said, "thank you for coming in. I'm told you wanted to talk to me. Sit down." She sat. He sat. He opened the folder and then, instead of looking at it, looked at her. "You stabilized Lieutenant Rourke last night," he said. "With Dr. Veld, yes. Before Dr. Veld could access the patient, you managed a military working dog that had refused contact with every other person in that room. Rex was protecting his handler. Once he understood I wasn't a threat, he stood down." "How did he understand that?" "I spoke to him calmly." Tate's expression didn't change. Rex is a specialized unit animal. He's been trained to respond to a specific command set used by his handler and authorized team members. Speaking calmly wouldn't account for his response. Claire didn't say anything. "You used his name," Tate said. "Rex. His name isn't on his vest in a way that would be visible at the distance you approached from. I could see the stenciling. Our people measured it. At the angle you entered, the stencil on the vest would have been at least partially obscured by the gurney rail." He leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Donovan, I'm not here to make trouble for you. Lieutenant Rourke is alive because of what you did last night, and that matters. What also matters is that someone came very close to reaching him this morning, and we don't know if they're going to try again, which means I need to understand every person in this building who has had contact with him, including you." "I understand," Claire said. "Your personnel file shows 8 years at Harlow General. Before that, 2 years at a walk-in clinic in Roanoke. Before that, a gap of about 4 years with no employment record. I was figuring things out. And before the gap, military service. The records are..." He paused. "Incomplete. That happens." "Not this kind of incomplete," Tate said. This kind of incomplete is deliberate." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and was answered. "What do you need from me?" Claire asked. "I need you to be honest with me about your background." "I was a combat medic. I served 2 tours. I left the military and I became a nurse." She held his gaze. "That's the honest answer." Tate looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him making a calculation, not about whether she was lying, because she wasn't exactly, but about how much of the truth she'd left out, and whether it was worth pushing. "All right," he said finally. "I may need to talk to you again." "I'll be here." She was almost at the door when he said, "Rex has been asking for you." She stopped. "We moved him to a holding space on the ground floor," Tate said. He's been unsettled all morning. When they walked him past the elevator bank an hour ago, he pulled toward the stairwell that leads to this floor. A pause. Toward wherever you were, we think. Claire kept her face neutral. Dogs do that sometimes, she said. Miss Donovan. His voice was even. I've worked federal cases for 22 years. I know when someone is being careful with me. She turned back, looked at him directly. I know you do, she said. And I know you're going to do your job regardless of what I say in this room. So let me just say this. Lieutenant Rourke needs to live. Whatever else is happening here, that's the part that matters. I'll help however I can with that. She left. Marcus Veld found her at the nurse's station on the second floor 40 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, which were quiet for a large man, but the way the hallway conversation dropped slightly when he came through, the small social pressure of his presence that she'd noticed in the trauma bay and recognized now as habitual. Donovan. She looked up from the chart she was updating. My office. Now. She followed him. His office was at the end of the second-floor corridor, past the orthopedic suite, with a window that looked out over the parking structure. It was organized in the precise way of someone who used organization as a form of control. Awards on the wall, framed and evenly spaced. Nothing personal. He closed the door and didn't offer her a seat. I pulled your file, he said. Dr. Adler mentioned you might. Your clinical record is excellent. Your patient outcomes are above average for your unit. You've been at this hospital for 8 years, and in that time you have not applied for a single advancement or additional certification. He said it like it was an accusation. Why? I like what I do. You know more than what you do. She didn't respond. I watched you in that trauma bay, Veld said. You weren't assisting. You were running half the resuscitation. Your technique, the way you positioned for the chest tube, the way you managed the airway, that's not floor nursing. That's surgical training or field medicine at a level that goes beyond standard combat medic. He leaned back against his desk. So I want to know, what are you and why are you here? I'm a nurse, Claire said. I'm here because I was working a shift when a patient came in. Don't do that. Don't do what? The deflection. His voice sharpened. I'm not interested in whatever reason you have for keeping your head down. What I am interested in is whether you're a liability to this hospital. We have federal agents camped on the second floor, an ICU patient with a security detail, and now it turns out we have a staff member with a classified military record who somehow has a personal relationship with a military working dog. He crossed his arms. That's a lot of variables. I don't have a personal relationship with the dog. Then explain what happened last night. She met his gaze steadily. I can't. Something moved across his face. Frustration, yes, but also something else. Calculation, she thought. Marcus Veld was very smart, and very smart people were sometimes more dangerous than direct threats, because they had a longer lead time, and you often didn't notice what they were doing until they'd already done it. Stay away from the Rourke case, he said. You've done what you can do. The federal team is handling his security. Your involvement ends here. If he needs medical support, we have doctors for that. You're a floor nurse. He said it with a particular flatness that wasn't quite cruelty, but was close to it. The tone of someone reminding you of your place in a hierarchy they believed in completely. Stay in your lane, Donovan. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment with her back against the wall, letting the instruction settle. Stay in your lane. She'd heard versions of that for 8 years, and she'd been good at following it because the whole point of the life she'd built here was the lane. The specific, manageable, bounded lane of a floor nurse at a mid-sized hospital in a city where nobody knew her name before she showed up. She'd been careful. She'd been so careful. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something, call it field instinct, call it the particular quality of silence that follows a warning you weren't supposed to need, made her pick up. Ms. Donovan? It was a voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, with the precise diction of someone who'd spent time on the military's communications side. We need you to step away from your current location. Go to the east stairwell. Don't take the elevator. Who is this? Someone who knows what Rex knows, the voice said, and someone who knows they're already watching you. The line went dead. Claire stood in the hallway. The normal sounds of the hospital continued around her. A PA announcement, a cart being rolled, someone laughing at the far end of the corridor. Normal sounds. Normal afternoon. She looked toward the elevator bay. There was a man standing near it who hadn't been there 20 minutes ago, in a gray maintenance jacket with a hat pulled low, reading something on a clipboard with the particular focused inattention of someone who was actually watching the hallway. The same gray jacket, the same hat. From the security footage, 15 feet from Rourke's door at 4 in the morning. He was here again, and he was looking at her. Claire didn't run. Running was how you told someone they'd found you. She turned left, away from the elevator bank, and walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and wasn't worried about it. Her heartbeat was elevated. She could feel it in her throat, but her stride didn't show it, because she'd spent enough time in situations where showing it got you killed. The east stairwell was 40 feet down the corridor, past the lab draw station and the supply closet and a bulletin board covered in outdated wellness announcements. She pushed through the door without looking back, and the moment it closed behind her, she pressed herself against the wall beside the hinge and counted. 1, 2, 3. The door didn't open. She went down. The stairwell smelled like industrial cleaner and old concrete, the particular smell of a building's bones, but the parts that didn't get renovated when the lobby got new tile. She went down 2 floors, came out on the ground level near the auxiliary exit, and stopped. There was a black SUV parked in the loading zone with its engine running. Not a hospital vehicle. The plates were government issue, the kind of blank government issue that told you nothing except that you weren't supposed to ask. The passenger window came down. The woman behind the wheel was maybe 40, with short cropped hair and the flat, assessing expression of someone who spent their professional life deciding in seconds whether a person was a threat or an asset. She was wearing a dark jacket over a tactical undershirt, and there was an earpiece in her left ear with a wire that disappeared into her collar. "Get in," she said. "I don't know you," Claire said. "No. But you know what's standing outside the elevator on the 2nd floor, and you know it's the same person from last night's security footage, and you know your name is now on a list it shouldn't be on." She reached across and pushed the door open. "I'm Captain Dana Yo, Defense Intelligence. Get in the vehicle, Ms. Donovan." Claire got in. Yo pulled out of the loading zone before the door was fully shut, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done vehicle extractions before. She didn't take the main exit. She went around the back of the building, past the maintenance yard, and out through a service entrance that Claire had walked past for 8 years without ever going through. "Are you going to tell me what's happening?" Claire asked. "Lieutenant Rourke was carrying documentation when he came in," Yo said, not looking away from the road. "Not on his person. Embedded in a device that was built into his vest lining. We extracted it before the hospital got a full look at him." "What kind of documentation?" "The kind that explains why someone came back this morning and why they're still in your building." Yo checked her mirror. The attempt on Rourke wasn't opportunistic. Someone tracked him to Harlow General within 90 minutes of his admission. That's either an inside leak or active surveillance on military medical transfers, and right now we don't know which. "You think it's inside?" "I think the man in the gray jacket walked through a maintenance corridor that requires a coded entry." "Yes." Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside, Fort Callum moved past in the gray afternoon. Strip malls, a gas station, a stretch of fast food that gave way to older residential blocks. The ordinary geography of a city she'd chosen specifically because it was ordinary. "Why did you call me?" she said. "I didn't. That was someone else." Yo's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, a careful neutrality that came from choosing words. "You have a file, Ms. Donovan, a real one, not the partial version in the hospital system. The people who need to know who you are." Claire felt something go tight in her chest. "That file is sealed. Sealed files get unsealed when there's sufficient operational need." Yo glanced at her briefly. "You want to be angry about that? I understand it. But right now I need you focused, because Rourke is going to be moved tonight and you are the only person in that building he's going to respond to." "He's sedated." "He's coming out of sedation. They reduced the drip 2 hours ago." Another mirror check. He came up conscious enough to say 2 things. The first was a code designation that I'm not going to repeat here. The second was a name. Claire already knew what was coming. She felt it before Yo said it, the way you feel a pressure change before a storm. "Yours," Yo said. The word sat between them in the vehicle. Outside, a light changed red, and Yo stopped for it. Perfectly normal. A government SUV at a red light in a mid-sized city on a Thursday afternoon. "He doesn't know me," Claire said. "He knows of you, the unit he came from, the people he worked with. Some of them knew you. From before." Yo paused. "Not from Fort Callum. From before Fort Callum." The light changed. Yo drove. Claire looked straight ahead and tried to work out which part of this she was most afraid of, and concluded that it was probably the part where a life she'd spent 4 years building very carefully around the concept of invisibility had just become visible to people she couldn't predict. They drove for 20 minutes and ended up at a nondescript office building on the edge of the city's light industrial district, the kind of building that existed in every mid-sized American city, 3 stories of gray concrete with a parking lot and a sign by the entrance that said something generic about consulting services. The kind of building you drove past 1,000 times and never thought about. Inside, it was different. The ground floor looked like an office. The second floor, accessed by a keycard reader and a stairwell that Yo walked her through without explanation, looked like an operations center. Screens, workstations, a conference table covered in maps and print outs, 3 people moving between them with the focused energy of a team running on a deadline. A man was standing at the head of the table. He was perhaps 60, with the erect posture of someone who'd been military for a long time, and the kind of face that had been weathered by something other than age. Not hard, weathered. There was a difference. He was in civilian clothes, but wearing them the way military people often wore civilian clothes, like they were a reasonable approximation of the real thing. "Ms. Donovan," he said, "Colonel Garrett Howell, retired, currently DIA senior consultant." "I know who you are," Claire said. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, but an acknowledgement. "Then you understand the situation has moved beyond what we initially— I understand that James Rourke is in a hospital bed with 2 gunshot wounds and someone in my building tried to get to him twice. I understand there's an operation moving and you need a warm body who Rex will respond to." She looked at him steadily. "I also understand you pulled a sealed file without notifying me, which means this conversation was already planned before I agreed to get in that vehicle." Howell didn't look away. Yes, she appreciated that. She'd expected a soft answer, and the directness of it recalibrated her slightly. "What do you want?" she asked. "Rourke needs to be transported to a secure medical facility tonight. He's stable enough to move, but not stable enough to go without medical support. And the team we'd normally use for this transfer has been compromised. 2 of our people who had the transport detail are the ones who flagged an access anomaly this morning and then went dark 40 minutes later." He paused and let that settle. "We don't know if they're burned or worse. We can't use them. You want me to do a military medical transport? I want you to accompany a patient you've already treated on a transport that will have full federal security to a facility where he can be properly protected." He gestured toward the table. "You would be medical support, not operational." "And Rex?" "Rex goes with Rourke. Rex doesn't travel without a medical handler he accepts." Howell looked at her with the directness he'd established. "You're the only person outside the original unit he's accepted since his handler was injured." The word injured landed with a particular weight. She didn't ask how badly. She'd learn what she needed to learn when she needed to learn it. "When?" she said. 2,200 hours. You have time to go back for what you need. I need to talk to someone at the hospital. Peggy Adler has already been told you have a family emergency. Your supervisor for the next 48 hours will be told the same." He said it matter-of-factly, the way people said things when they'd already handled them. "We've been running point on your cover since this morning. That should have made her feel managed." It did make her feel managed, but it also meant Howell had started moving pieces before she agreed to anything, which meant he either knew she'd say yes, or he'd accepted the risk that she wouldn't, and she wasn't sure which of those possibilities she was more uncomfortable with. She said yes anyway. Because Rourke was in a hospital bed and someone had been 15 feet from his door at 4 in the morning, and the 2 people who were supposed to protect him were now dark. And some part of her, the part that had spent 4 years pretending it didn't exist, wasn't able to make itself step back and let someone else handle it. That part of her was the problem, and she knew it, and she went back to the hospital to get her bag anyway. She was in the locker room when Marcus Veld found her. Not the aggressive version she'd seen in his office. This was quieter, which was worse. He came in without knocking, which told her he'd been watching for her return, and stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who had been thinking very hard about something and had reached a conclusion he wasn't pleased with. "You left," he said. "I had something to handle." "With who?" She looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "You left with a woman in a government vehicle. I saw you from the window." He came into the room and let the door close behind him. "I asked Derek Colson about the federal team upstairs. He gave me the standard line about ongoing security protocols. I asked Tate directly, and he said you were not part of any active inquiry." A pause. "So I want to know who you left with and where you went." "That's not really your business, Dr. Veld. It is if you're bringing something into my hospital that I don't know about." "I'm not bringing anything in. I came back for my things." She reached into the locker and pulled out her bag. "I have a family situation." "You said that already. Adler told me." "Then you know what you need to know." He stepped forward, just slightly. Not threatening, but deliberate, closing space in the way that powerful people sometimes did when they were used to space closing working for them. "Donovan, I want to help you. If something is happening here that involves you, You told me to stay in my lane." She said it simply, not unkindly, just accurately. "I'm staying in my lane. My lane currently takes me out of the building." Veld's jaw worked. "If there's a security situation, talk to Tate. He's handling it." She shouldered her bag. "I'll call in when I'm back." She moved past him toward the door, and he said quietly, "The dog looked for you again. About an hour ago. Flores said he kept facing toward the stairs." She paused with her hand on the doorframe. "Rex knows something about you that I don't," Veld said. "I've worked trauma for 23 years, and I've never seen a military working dog break protocol for a stranger. They don't do that. It's not how they're trained." He wasn't accusing her now, just saying what he'd observed. "Whatever that is, whatever it means, I think you should be careful." It was the most human thing he'd said to her in their entire acquaintance, which lasted less than 24 hours and had mostly been him treating her like furniture that had developed opinions. "I know," she said. "Thank you." She left. That's it. The transport was scheduled out of a private lot behind the DIA building, not from the hospital. Rourke would be moved to the vehicle in a medical transport that looked like a standard ambulance but wasn't. Heavier plating, modified interior, a communications array that Yo explained in the vehicle on the way over, and that Claire paid close attention to because understanding the equipment around you was the thing that kept you functional when everything else went sideways. By the time they reached the staging area, Rourke was there. He was on a gurney, alert in the specific way of someone who'd been pulled from sedation and hadn't yet figured out the full geography of where he was or what was happening. His color was better than the night before, still pale, still marked by what had happened to him, but the gray was gone. He was tracking the room, moving his gaze from person to person, and when Claire came through the door, his eyes stopped. Rex, who had been lying at the side of the gurney, lifted his head and then stood up. "Hey," Rourke said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "I know you." "You don't," Claire said. "But you know Rex, and Rex knows me. That might be close enough." He looked at the dog, who had moved to stand beside Claire, with the easy confidence of an animal who'd made a decision and wasn't reconsidering it. Something shifted in Rourke's expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of a calculation that might become trust. "You're Donovan," he said. "Yes. They told me about you, the old unit. Stories." He tried to move and winced, and she was already checking the dressing before he finished the attempt. "You were supposed to be some kind of ghost." "I'm a nurse," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. "Sure." He didn't sound convinced. "What's the plan?" "You get transported. I keep you alive in transit. Rex stays with you." "Simple." "Simple," she agreed. It wasn't simple. The convoy left at 22:10, 2 vehicles ahead and 1 behind, with the transport in the middle. Howell had briefed the route, 90 minutes to the secure facility, 2 highway segments and 1 section of state road, chosen for coverage and limited access points. Standard federal convoy logic, the kind that worked until it didn't. Claire sat in the back of the transport with Rourke and Rex and a young medic named Porter. who was technically the lead medical on the transport, and who handled this gracefully by deferring to Claire on everything, which told her either Howell had briefed him or he was smart enough to read a room. She ran a line, checked the vitals, listened to his lung sounds. The right side was better, the left still reluctant, and the drainage from the chest tube was tapering off in a way that was mostly good news. Rourke watched her work with the focused attention of someone who had been dependent on field medics and knew what good looked like. "You're checking the tube more than you need to," he said. "I know. What's wrong with it?" "Nothing yet." She adjusted the position slightly. "There's a small risk of re-expansion pulmonary edema if the lung comes back too fast. I'm watching for it." "That's bad?" "It can be." He was quiet for a moment. Rex had arranged himself across the foot of the gurney, his chin on his paws, his eyes open. The transport moved smoothly, the highway sounds muffled by the plating. "The thing I was carrying," Rourke said. "The documentation, they got it out okay?" "I'm told yes." "You don't know what it is?" "No." "Good." He said it with a particular weight, not hostile. More like, the less people know, the fewer people are in the blast radius. "I just need to know it got to the right people." "Howell has it." Rourke's expression did something complicated. "Howell?" he said. "You know him." "I know of him." He looked at the ceiling. "That's fine." "That's probably fine." It was not a ringing endorsement, and Claire filed it away in the part of her mind that had been filing things away all day, the accumulating small data points that she didn't have enough context to evaluate yet, but that she'd need later. She'd been doing that her whole career, collecting, waiting for the pattern to become visible. She was still waiting when the lead vehicle's brake lights went red and stayed red. Porter looked up from his monitor. Claire looked at the small communication panel on the wall. The radio crackled once, then went static. Then the explosion hit. Not the transport. Ahead of them, to the left, close enough that the blast wave rocked the vehicle sideways, and the interior lights flickered, and Rex was on his feet before the sound finished registering. Claire grabbed the gurney rail with both hands. Rourke's monitor screamed in alarm as his vitals spiked from the adrenaline. "Hold on," she said to Porter, to Rourke, to no one specifically. The transport lurched to a stop. The radio screamed back to life. Fragmented voices, people calling positions, the particular compressed urgency of a tactical situation breaking open, and then Yo's voice cut through everything else. "Contact left. Lead vehicle is down. We are compromised. All units, we are..." Another explosion, farther, but directional, the kind of controlled charge that was designed to stop a vehicle rather than destroy it. Blocking the road. They were being hemmed in. Rourke was trying to sit up. Claire put a hand on his chest. Not hard, just present. "Don't. You need to keep that lung intact." She looked at Porter. "Lock the interior panel. Don't open the doors unless it's Yo or Howell personally." "What are you going to do?" Porter said. The rear door of the transport had a secondary panel. She'd noticed it when they loaded, a recessed cabinet that she'd assumed was additional medical supplies. She opened it now. It wasn't additional medical supplies. It was a compact tactical kit. Vest, communications unit, and a sidearm. Rourke looked at her from the gurney. Something in his face had settled into a kind of recognition. Not surprise, but confirmation. The expression of someone who'd been told something and was now watching it be true. "Ghost," he said quietly. She strapped the vest on over her scrubs. It fit well enough. She checked the sidearm by feel. Magazine seated, chamber clear, safety on, and clipped the comm unit to her collar. "Ghost," she corrected, "is not a job title, and I'm still a nurse." She looked at Rex. The dog was watching her with his whole body, taut and focused, waiting. "Stay with him," she told Rex. Rex sat back down on the gurney step, pressed against Rourke's leg. Outside, the sounds had changed. The radio voices had gone quiet, which was worse than the noise. Quiet meant people were down or moving or both. And in the dark, on a stretch of state road with no civilian witnesses and a compromised convoy, it meant someone had planned this very carefully and executed it very well. She went to the rear door. Her hand was on the handle. Her heartbeat was doing something she recognized from a long time ago. Not calm, not panic, the thing between them that her body had learned to use instead of either. The door opened from the outside. She had the sidearm up before she registered who was there. Harlan Tate. Jacket torn, a cut above his left eye bleeding freely, radio in his hand. He looked at the weapon, then at her, then at the vest over the scrubs, and his expression did a rapid series of adjustments. "We have 4 agents down," he said. 2 vehicles incapacitated. Howell is pinned behind the rear vehicle with 2 shooters maintaining position. He looked past her at Rourke. "They're not trying to destroy the transport. They want him alive." "Which means they want to take him." "Yes." "How many?" "At least 6, possibly more. They came out of the tree line. It was staged, full preparation. This wasn't improvised." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the strain underneath it. "I have 3 agents still mobile. We can hold them back, but not indefinitely, and I cannot call in air support without—" He stopped. "Without what?" "Without going through a channel that we now believe has been compromised." The implication took about 2 seconds to land. The leak. The person who'd tracked Rourke to Harlow General in 90 minutes. The coded entry in the maintenance corridor. The transport route that someone had known well enough to stage a full tactical interception. It was inside. Not just inside the hospital. Inside the operation itself. "The route," Claire said, "was distributed to 7 people." Tate's jaw was tight. "One of them is Howell. 3 are agents who are currently down or accounted for. That leaves 3. 3 people who'd had the route. 3 people who were unaccounted for in terms of the leak." She thought about Rourke's expression when she'd said Howell's name. Probably fine. She thought about the secondary panel in the transport. A tactical kit that had been loaded before the mission that she hadn't been told about, that was sized to fit someone roughly her build. She thought about Howell saying, "You're not operational." Someone had thought she might need to be anyway. "Give me a position on the shooters," she said. Tate looked at her for a moment. The scrubs under the vest, the sidearm, the 8 years of careful invisibility that had just walked directly out the door, and made a decision. 2 on the left flank behind the lead vehicle wreckage, 2 at the roadblock, 2 mobile working toward the tree line on the right. He held out his radio. "Howell's frequency is 7. She took it. "Donovan." He caught her arm, not rough, just catching. "If this goes wrong, it won't," she said. She didn't believe that exactly, but she said it the way you said things in situations like this, because the alternative was to stand in the doorway calculating failure probabilities while Howell was pinned and Rourke was bleeding, and 6 people with tactical training and inside information were tightening a perimeter around a vehicle with a seriously wounded soldier in it. She stepped out into the dark. The night air was cold and smelled like cordite and burning plastic from the lead vehicle, which was on its side 30 meters ahead with smoke rising from the engine. The road was a 2-lane state highway with tree lines on both sides, no houses visible, no lights except the damaged vehicles, and a pale half-moon that gave just enough to see by and not quite enough to be comfortable. She moved right, away from the wreckage, toward the tree line. She'd been told 2 shooters, mobile, working that direction. If they were moving to flank, they'd come in from the northeast, angled toward the rear of the transport. She heard one of them before she saw him. Not much. Just the specific sound of someone moving through underbrush with training, but not enough training. The kind of careful silence that was close to actual silence, but not quite. Because actual silence was something you either had or you spent years developing, and most people, even tactical people, didn't have it in a night environment with adrenaline running. She had it. She'd had it for a long time. She positioned, waited, let him come to her, and when he was close enough, she made a choice. Not the lethal choice, because she didn't know yet which of the 3 root holders she was looking at, and a dead man couldn't answer questions. And the whole point of whatever Rourke was carrying was that it needed to reach the right people and then be understood by them. She hit him with the kind of precise, controlled force that ended the problem without ending the man, and he went down quietly, and she was already moving again before he finished falling. The second mobile shooter was 20 meters to the north. She heard the radio crackle on his person, someone calling positions, realizing they'd lost contact with the first man, and that gave her a half-second of advantage before he turned. In that half-second, she saw his face, and she recognized him, not from tonight, not from Fort Callum. From a long time before that, from a world she'd been very careful about leaving, from a photograph in a briefing packet she'd been given in a concrete room in a country she'd never say the name of out loud. He was military, or had been. Decorated. The kind of decorated you only got for things that were never fully explained in official paperwork. He recognized her too. She saw it happen. The shock, the recalibration, the very specific expression of someone who had been told something and was now staring at proof that what they'd been told was incomplete. "Donovan," he said. She had the weapon level. "Down, now, hands where I can see them." He didn't move. "You don't understand what's in that transport," he said. "You don't know what Rourke is carrying or who it's going to hurt." "I know it's not your call. They told you Howell is clean." He took a step, not toward her, to the side, careful, the step of someone looking for an angle. "Did they tell you who authorized the seal on your file? Who decided you were too operational to be brought back and too much of a liability to be left free?" She didn't respond. Her weapon didn't move. "Howell," he said. It was always Howell. In the distance, on the road, she heard Tate's voice on the radio. Positions being called, the tactical situation shifting, agents finding their feet again. The window for this conversation was closing. "On the ground," she said. "Last time." He looked at her for one more second, the look of a man making a calculation about odds and coming up short, and then he went down. She secured him the way she'd been taught, efficiently, without extra movement, with the particular practice quality of something you'd done enough times that your hands knew it before your mind finished the instruction. She zip-tied his wrist to a tree root and took his radio. Then she stood up in the dark with the sounds of a collapsing tactical ambush around her and the cold air on her face and the weight of what he'd just said settling over her like something she'd been carrying for 4 years and had almost managed to put down. Howell's name on her file. The tactical kit sized for her, loaded before the mission. The route compromised from inside. She'd come out here to keep Rourke alive. She'd done that. She was still doing that. But the thing she'd been afraid of since she picked up that phone call in the hospital hallway, the thing she'd been running from for 4 years in the specific, ordinary lane of a floor nurse at a mid-sized hospital, was already here. It had been here since the moment Rex sat down in a trauma bay and looked at her like she was someone he'd been waiting for. The radio on her hip crackled. Tate's voice. "South flank is clear. We have them pulled back. Donovan, what's your status?" She clicked the radio twice. Alive. She started walking back toward the road. Behind her, in the transport, Rourke was still breathing. Rex was still watching the door. Porter was still running monitors and pretending he wasn't terrified, which was the most any of them could do. Ahead of her, through the smoke and the ruined vehicles, Howell was standing at the roadblock with 2 agents, looking in her direction. Even from 30 meters, she could see him watching her with the expression of a man who'd just learned something unexpected. Not about the ambush, about her. And she understood, standing there in the dark in scrubs and a tactical vest with cordite on her hands, that the conversation she'd been avoiding for 4 years was going to happen now, whether she wanted it to or not. The question was, who was going to control it? She walked back to the road with her hands visible and her weapon holstered, because the agents on the perimeter were still running hot, and she didn't need to get shot by friendly fire after everything else. Tate met her halfway. He had a compress pressed against the cut above his eye, which had stopped bleeding but looked like it needed stitches he wasn't going to get for a while. He looked at her. The vest, the zip ties she was carrying, the second radio on her hip, and didn't say anything for a moment. "2 mobile shooters secured," she said. "Zip-tied to a root system about 40 meters into the tree line northeast. They're not going anywhere." "Alive?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "The other 4 are either down or fled. We have 2 in custody." He turned toward the roadblock, where Howell was still standing, watching them. "We need to move Rourke. This location is burned, and we don't know if they called in a secondary." "They did," she said. "Standard tactical protocol for a failed interception is a secondary fallback team. If the first wave doesn't complete the objective in..." She stopped herself. "We need to move. Now." Tate looked at her with the expression she was getting used to, the one where he was rapidly revising his model of who she was. He didn't ask the question out loud. He was smart enough not to, here, in the open. "Transport is operational?" she asked. "Rear vehicle took shrapnel, but it drives. We can transfer Rourke." "Do it. Porter stays with him. I want Rex in the same compartment." "You're not asking?" "No," she said. "I'm not." She moved past him toward Howell before he could respond. Howell watched her come. He'd been watching her since she stepped out of the tree line, and she'd used those 30 meters to decide how to play this. Not the confrontation, not yet, because the road was not the place, and Rourke was not stable enough for her to have a conversation that might take a bad turn. But she needed to look at Howell directly and read him, because the man in the tree line had told her something, and she needed to know whether it was true or whether it was the kind of thing people said in the dark when they were trying to get you to lower your weapon. "You're intact," Howell said. "Yes." "2 mobile shooters? Secured? Alive?" She held his gaze. "One of them knew me, knew my name. He had intelligence that included my background, my file, and my connection to this operation." Something moved through Howell's expression, carefully controlled, but there. Not surprise, something closer to confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "We'll debrief properly at the facility," he said. "One of the things he said was that you authorized the seal on my file." She kept her voice level. "Is that true?" Howell looked at her for a long moment. Around them, agents were moving with purpose, transferring equipment, securing the 2 prisoners, getting the rear vehicle positioned. Nobody was listening to this conversation. Or everyone was. "That conversation happens at the facility," he said. "Not here." "That's not a denial." "No," he said. "It's not." She let it sit. Because she'd been right. The road was not the place. And because Rourke needed to move and Rex was still in that transport and Porter was in there alone with a patient and a combat dog and the sounds of a tactical aftermath all around him, and all of that mattered more right now than the shape of a 4-year-old decision she couldn't change tonight. She went back to the transport. Porter looked up when she opened the rear door with the expression of someone who had held it together through sheer determination and was very relieved to have somewhere else to put that energy. "He's stable," Porter said. "Pressure held. The drainage, I see it." She checked the tube. The output had increased slightly from the movement and stress, which was expected and manageable. Rourke was conscious, watching her with the flat alertness of a man running on adrenaline and whatever residual sedation was still in his system. Rex was pressed against his leg, tense but controlled. "We're moving," she told them both. "It's going to be another 45 minutes. Stay still." "I heard shooting," Rourke said. "Yes." "Are we clear?" "For now." He looked at the zip ties still in her hand, then at the vest, then at her face. "How many?" "2 secured. 4 down or fled." She dropped the zip ties and started checking his IV line. "We think there's a secondary team. We're not stopping." "Good call." He winced when the vehicle shifted as someone moved in the front. "Donovan, the man in the tree line. Did you recognize him?" She paused, just briefly. "What do you know about that?" "The unit I came from, before this assignment." He was choosing his words with the care of a man who was used to compartmentalizing and wasn't sure how much to open. "There were people we were warned about, people who'd been inside and gone the other direction. One of them, senior, decorated, disappeared from official records about 18 months ago. He was flagged as potentially connected to the network I was carrying documentation on." "What's his name?" "We called him Voss." The vehicle started moving. Claire grabbed the rail. "Voss was in the tree line." Rourke closed his eyes briefly. "Then they're not just trying to recover the documentation. They're trying to contain everyone who's seen it or can speak to it." He opened his eyes. "That includes you now. Whether you know what's in it or not." She understood what he was saying. She was already in it, had been in it since Rex sat down in Trauma Bay 3 and the room went quiet. But in it as a witness and a medic was different from in it as a target. She thought about the maintenance corridor, the coded entry. The man in the gray jacket who'd come back to the hospital in the middle of the day and watched her from the elevator bay. They'd been watching her before the convoy, before the transport, before Howell briefed her on the operation. They'd been watching her since Rourke came through the door. The vehicle hit the highway and accelerated, and she braced and focused on her patient, because that was still the most useful thing she could do, and some part of her understood that if she let herself fully process the scope of what she'd just stepped into, she'd lose time she didn't have. The secure facility was a former National Guard installation 43 miles outside Fort Callum, the kind of place that looked decommissioned from the road but wasn't. They came in through a service gate, and the medical bay was small and clean and better equipped than she'd expected, with a proper surgical setup and a staff of 2. A physician named Dr. Alicia Ford, compact and precise, who assessed Rourke with the efficiency of someone who'd done military medicine in environments considerably less comfortable than this, and a tech named Marco, who ran the equipment without needing to be asked. Claire briefed Ford in 2 minutes while they transferred Rourke from the gurney, chest tube in place, output slowing, right lung re-expanding adequately on last auscultation. No signs of re-expansion edema, pressure stable, 2 gunshot wounds with surgical repair needed when he was strong enough for general anesthesia, estimated 48 to 72 hours. Ford listened, examined, and said, "Agreed. We'll hold the surgery." Then she looked at Claire's vest and scrubs and said with a very controlled neutrality, "Are you injured?" "No." "You should still be evaluated. Later." Forde decided not to argue. Claire helped transfer the patient, confirmed Rex was settled, and then walked out of the medical bay and into the corridor and stood against the wall with her hands at her sides and breathed for a moment. Just breathed, the way you did when the operational phase was over and your body needed 30 seconds to catch up to the fact that it was allowed to stop running. The corridor was fluorescent-lit concrete, the institutional beige of every military building she'd ever been in. It smelled like cleaning solution and recycled air. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Howell's voice and Tate's voice and others, the controlled urgency of a command team absorbing what had just happened and figuring out the next step. She let herself have the 30 seconds. Then she went to find Howell. Jet. The debrief room was a square with a table and chairs and a whiteboard with 3 names written on it that someone had partially erased. Howell was at the head of the table. Tate was to his left. There were 2 other people Claire didn't know. A woman in her 30s with DIA credentials visible on her jacket, and a man closer to 50 who wasn't wearing any credentials at all, which told her something. They looked up when she came in. She sat down across from Howell and put both hands flat on the table. "Voss," she said, "that's who was in the tree line. That's who had my name in my file." The room absorbed this. The woman with the DIA credentials wrote something down. The man with no credentials didn't move. "We know Voss," Howell said. "Then you know he's connected to the network Rourke was documenting." "We suspected. This confirms it." "He told me you authorized the seal on my file." She kept her voice even. "He said you made the decision to classify my record and remove me from active status." Howell's expression was the expression of a man who had been waiting for this and had decided, somewhere between the tree line and this room, to be straight about it. "Yes." "Why?" "Because 4 years ago you witnessed an operation that went badly wrong in ways that were going to have significant consequences for people inside the military command structure. We had 2 options. Investigate formally, which would have required bringing you in as a material witness and exposing you to whatever the people being investigated might do about that, or move you out of the system quietly and let the investigation run without you at the center of it." He paused. "You were given a choice." She remembered it. A room not unlike this one. A man not unlike Howell, though it hadn't been Howell. Older, more tired, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running a long game problem for longer than was sustainable. The choice had been presented as a question, which was the polite version of an instruction. Step back, step away, become someone the network didn't have a reason to look at. She'd taken it because she was 29 and had just spent 6 months watching what the network did to people it had reasons to look at. "The investigation," she said. "Rourke's documentation. Is that the same network?" "Grown," Howell said. 4 years ago, it was contractors and 2 senior officers. What Rourke brought us shows it's expanded into military procurement, several congressional offices, and an arms pipeline that's been running for at least 3 years. Who's at the top of it now?" The man with no credentials spoke for the first time. His voice was the kind of flat that came from decades of not inflecting. "That's what the documentation is being analyzed to determine." "Voss was the field arm," Tate said. "The person directing him, the operational commander of this network, hasn't been identified yet." Claire looked at Howell. "You loaded a tactical kit in that transport, sized to my build." "Yes." "You told me I was medical support." "You were." "You also have a particular skill set that became relevant." He met her gaze without looking away from it. "I knew the route might be compromised. I didn't know at which point or by whom. I wanted someone in that transport who could handle a worst case." "Without telling me." without telling you, because if I'd told you the full picture, you might not have agreed to come. It was, she thought, probably true. It was also the kind of decision that someone made when they decided your value as an asset outweighed your right to full information, which was the kind of thinking she'd spent 4 years specifically getting away from. "Who are the 3 people who had the route?" she asked. Howell gestured to Tate, who laid a printed sheet on the table. 3 names. She looked at them. 2 were agents she'd seen tonight. One was down with a concussion and a broken arm. One was currently helping process the prisoners, accounted for. The 3rd name was Marcus Veld. She looked at Howell. Dr. Veld was read in on the transport as a precautionary measure, Howell said, because Rourke had been under his care, and we needed his cooperation in managing the timeline of the patient transfer. He was given the route window, but not the specific time. The specific time was enough, the woman from DIA said. A 2-hour window on a single route gives you what you need to stage an interception. The room was quiet. Claire thought about Veld in the locker room. His voice, his questions. You left with a woman in a government vehicle. The specific quality of his interest, not quite threatening, but covering too much ground, wanting too many details. She'd read it as personality, the controlling temperament of a man used to being the center of every room he entered. She hadn't read it as this. "He's still at the hospital," she said. "We know," Howell said. "Rourke's medical records are there. The documentation of his admission, his treatment, our people are pulling that now. If Veld has access to the record system, Donovan." Howell's voice was firm but not unkind. "We have it under control." She wanted to believe that. She wasn't sure she did, because an hour ago they'd had a convoy under control, and it had gone very differently. "I want to be in the room when you bring him in," she said. "That's not standard procedure. I'm not standard anything at this point." She held his gaze. "I've worked with him. I can read his responses in a way your people can't, and he was in my hospital treating patients I'm responsible for. And if he's connected to this—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I want to be in the room." Howell looked at the man with no credentials. Something passed between them, the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to communicate in compressed signals. "Observe only," the man said. She'd take it. They brought Veld in the following morning, not to the facility, to a secondary location in Fort Callum, a federal building with proper interview rooms, because the facility was a medical and operational site, and this was a different kind of work. Claire watched through a one-way panel in an adjacent room, which was the worst possible position because she couldn't hear the temperature of his voice, only the words coming through the speaker system, and words without temperature were only half the picture. But she watched. Veld came in looking like Marcus Veld. The posture, the expensive jacket, the particular expression of a man who was deciding how much respect this situation deserved. He'd been told he was being interviewed regarding the security situation at Harlow General, which was true and also incomplete. Tate ran the interview. He was good at it. The specific kind of patient, methodical good that she'd noticed in him from the beginning, the quality of someone who would rather wait 4 hours for a thread to appear than pull in the wrong direction. The first 40 minutes were about the hospital, about Rourke's admission, the timeline, the federal presence. Veld answered everything with the slightly impatient precision of a man doing someone else a favor. He corrected Tate on 2 procedural details, which was the behavior of someone who was confident, not someone who was afraid. Then Tate asked about the route, not directly. He came at it from the side. When Veld had been informed of the transport, what information he'd been given, whether he'd discussed it with anyone. Veld said he'd been given a general window and no specific route details. Tate put a document on the table. The briefing sheet, with the route. Veld looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something happened in the stillness of his face, a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of a moment ago. "That's not what I was given," he said. "This is the document provided to you at 14:30 yesterday," Tate said. "It has your acknowledgement signature on the 2nd page." Veld turned to the 2nd page. He looked at the signature. "That's not my signature." "It's a very good copy." "I'm telling you it is not mine." He looked up. "Someone forged it." In the observation room, Claire leaned forward slightly. She was reading his body, the set of his shoulders, the position of his hands, the exact quality of his stillness. She'd spent 8 years watching bodies in trauma bays and learning to read the things they said when they couldn't talk. And what Marcus Veld's body was saying right now was not the language of calculated performance. He was telling the truth. She was almost certain of it, and almost was a very uncomfortable margin in this context. Tate kept going. He was methodical. He covered Veld's movements the previous day, his communications, his access to the hospital systems. Veld answered everything, sometimes impatiently, sometimes with the clipped precision of a man who is getting angry and controlling it, but always answered. An hour into the interview, Tate's phone buzzed. He looked at it, excused himself, and came out into the corridor where Claire was standing. The root document, Tate said. Our analyst ran the metadata. The file was accessed by 2 different users, Veld's credentials and a second account that was created 48 hours ago using a spoofed employee ID. Someone used a duplicate account to access the document and leave Veld's name on it. Yes. Which means Veld may not have been the leak. He wasn't. She said it with more certainty than she'd had in the observation room because the metadata confirmed what his body had told her. Who had access to the system to create a spoofed employee ID? Tate looked at her. The answer was already in his expression. Someone inside the hospital with administrator-level credentials. That's a short list. Very short. He looked down at his phone. Coulson, he said. Derek Coulson, hospital administrator. She thought about Coulson, the expensive suits, the handshake, the way he'd appeared in the background of every conversation about the federal team at the hospital. Not obstructive, just present, the way that people in certain positions were always present, accessible, cooperative, to the point where you stopped noticing them. He had access to everything, she said. Every federal communication routed through his office, the security protocols, the team briefings, the staffing information. The briefing to Veld went through his office. He swapped the document. She was already moving toward the door. Veld's signature was forged. Coulson leaked the route, which means he's the hospital insider, which means he's connected to Voss, which means the network has a direct line into every federal communication that came through Harlow General for the last 48 hours. Including, she thought, the communications about Howell's debrief, about the facility, about where Rourke was now. Her stomach went cold. Tate. Her voice was flat. Has Coulson been in contact with anyone since you left the hospital? Tate was already reaching for his radio. He didn't get to use it. The alert came through the facility's own system. A priority notification that lit up every device in the corridor simultaneously. Tate's phone and the speaker mounted on the wall, and the secondary unit on Claire's belt that Howell had given her before the debrief. Facility perimeter breach, east entrance, multiple contacts. She was running before the alert finished. The facility had 1 medical bay and 1 patient in it, and that patient was James Rourke. And the east entrance was the service entrance that was closest to the medical bay, and whoever was coming through it knew exactly where they were going. She took the stairwell, faster than the corridor, and it let her come in from the upper level of the medical bay, which had a service walkway she'd noticed during the transfer but hadn't thought she'd need. She thought about it now. She came through the upper door and looked down. The medical bay was a single large room with the main entrance at ground level on the south wall and the service access on the east. Ford was backed against the equipment rack on the west side. Marco was on the floor, not moving, though she could see he was breathing. Rex was on his feet in the corner near Rourke's bed, rigid, ears flat, a low vibration in his chest that wasn't quite sound. 2 men in tactical gear, no insignia, had come through the east access. One had a weapon on Ford. The other was moving toward Rourke's bed. Rourke was awake. He was looking at the man coming toward him with the specific fixed expression of someone who had been in enough bad situations to know that showing fear was one of the least useful things available to him right now. The chest tube was still in place. The IV lines were still running. If they tried to move him roughly, the tube would shift, and a shifting chest tube in a partially re-expanded lung was... She ran the calculation, and it was bad. It was very bad. The kind of bad that could kill him in the time it took to get him back to any kind of surgical facility. She had 4 seconds, maybe 5, before the man reached the bed. She assessed the walkway, 12 feet above the floor, a cable rack running along the east wall that came within 8 feet of the bed. No direct line to the man near Ford without crossing open space and making herself a target. Rex was looking up. He'd heard her. She couldn't see his face clearly from this angle, but she could see his posture shift, not toward the threat, toward her. Waiting. She made a decision. She dropped from the walkway onto the cable rack, caught it, swung down, and landed in the space between Rourke's bed and the approaching man, and said, "Rex, hold." Rex covered the man near Ford in under 2 seconds, not attacking, positioning 80 pounds of trained muscle between the armed agent and the doctor, jaw closed, but communicating with total clarity that the closed jaw was a temporary arrangement. The man who'd been heading for Rourke stopped. He was in full tactical gear with a balaclava covering everything except his eyes. And she had a sidearm from the vest she was still wearing, and she had it up and level. And she was very aware that she was in scrubs from the day before with a borrowed vest, and she was placing herself between a wounded Navy lieutenant and 2 armed operatives in what was technically a medical bay and not a tactical environment. And the whole situation was, she registered the word absurd and filed it away, not sustainable. "Step back," she said. The man near Rourke looked at her. He looked at Rex, who had the second man very effectively stationary. He looked at the weapon in her hand. He did the math. He didn't step back. "The patient gets moved," he said. His voice was flat, professional. "You can walk out. We have no interest in you." "You have interest in me," she said. "You've had interest in me for 48 hours. The gray jacket, the maintenance corridor. You're not Voss's people. You're the same people who were at the convoy, and you came here because Coulson told you where we are." She kept the weapon level. "Which means you know who I am, and you know that I know you're not going to shoot me in a medical bay with a federal team responding to a perimeter breach in about 90 seconds. The man was quiet. "So here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're going to step back. Rex is going to keep your partner very still. And when the federal team comes through that door, you're going to be the most useful you've ever been in your life, because the network you're working for is already burning, and the people who are going to burn least are the ones who help us understand how it works." Rourke made a sound from the bed. Not distress. She checked without moving her eyes from the man. More like someone suppressing a laugh at the worst possible moment. She understood it. The situation had a kind of terrible clarity that was almost funny if you were tired and hurt, and had been watching a nurse in scrubs hold down a tactical situation. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her. She felt the shift in his focus a half second before she heard the door behind her open. Not the main entrance. The east access, the way they'd come in. A third man. She'd counted 2. There were 3. She started to turn. Something hit her from behind. Not a weapon, a body, someone coming in fast and low and catching her across the shoulders. And she went down hard. The weapon going wide. Her knee hitting the floor with the kind of impact that sent white light through her field of vision. Rex barked. One sharp sound. And she heard the scuffle of the man near Ford reacting to the dog's attention shifting. She got up. It took longer than she wanted. Her knee was wrong. Not broken. She assessed that in the half second she had, but wrong enough that standing on it was a project rather than a given. The third man was between her and Rourke's bed. The first man had his weapon back up and was pointing it at Rex, who had gone still with the trained precision of an animal that understood the geometry of the situation. "That's enough," the third man said, and then she heard his voice properly without the adrenaline distortion of the first second, and she knew it. She looked at him. He'd taken the balaclava off, which told her he wasn't worried about being identified, which told her something she didn't want to know about the confidence he had and how this situation was going to end. Garrett Howell stood in the medical bay with the calm authority of a man who had just walked through his own perimeter. "Claire," he said, her first name for the first time. "I'm sorry it went this way." The room was very quiet. Rex was frozen. Ford was pressed against the wall. Rourke had gone completely still on the bed, the monitor above him tracking his heart rate with a steadiness that she found, in some remote part of her mind, genuinely impressive. She was on one knee with a useless weapon hand and a knee that was going to be a serious problem in about 30 seconds when the adrenaline metabolized. "You're the top," she said. Not a question. Howell didn't deny it. He looked at her with something that was almost regret, or the closest thing to regret that a man like him could produce. Not for what he was doing, but for the shape it had taken. The documentation Rourke is carrying would end a great many careers, mine included, and the careers of people who have done more for this country's actual security than they'll ever be credited for, through channels that don't appear in any official record. He took a step forward. The network is not what you think it is. It's an arms trafficking ring. It's a funding mechanism for operations that can't be funded officially, for outcomes that need to happen, and can't be allowed to happen through sanctioned means. His voice was even, the voice of a man explaining something to someone he considered intelligent enough to understand it. You were military. You know what I mean. I know that's what everyone says, she said, right before the list of people who died for the mechanism. Claire, don't. She said it quietly. Don't explain it to me like I'm going to understand my way into agreeing with you. The door at the south wall, the main entrance, came open. Tate came through it with 4 agents and a weapon already up, and the geometry of the room changed in the space of 2 seconds. Howell's men looking at the new vectors, Rex releasing his attention from the restrained man as the agents covered him, and Howell himself doing the rapid calculation of someone who had just run out of positions. He looked at Claire. She looked at him. It's over, she said. For a moment she thought he was going to run it out, make them take him, turn it into something louder. But Howell was, above everything else, a man who understood when a tactical position was untenable. He looked at the 4 agents. He looked at Tate. He put his weapon on the floor carefully, because he was precise about things even at the end, and he straightened up and said nothing. Tate crossed the room, cuffed him, read him the words. Claire let herself lean against the equipment rack, because her knee was doing what she'd known it was going to do, and she needed a surface. Ford appeared at her side with the expression of someone who had just experienced something substantially outside their training and was channeling the experience directly into clinical assessment. Your knee, Ford said. I know. Sit down. In a minute. Rourke's voice came from the bed. Is it done? She looked at him. He was looking at the doorway where Tate was walking Howell out, and his face had the particular settled quality of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was watching it be set down. The documentation is still valid? She asked Tate, who was passing. It goes to the independent review board tonight, Tate said. Howell can't touch it now. Nobody in the network can. Rourke exhaled. Rex moved to the bedside and put his chin on the mattress, and Rourke's hand came down onto the dog's head with the automatic quality of something he'd done 1,000 times. And she watched it, and felt something settle in herself too, though not cleanly. Nothing in the last 48 hours had been clean. She sat down on the equipment rack step because her knee required it. Forty crouched in front of her and started assessing, and Claire let her and stared at the south wall where Howell had just been walked out, and worked through the shape of what she now knew. The network's commander was in custody. The documentation was secure. Voss was in federal custody from the tree line. But Coulson was still at the hospital. Coulson, who had access to everything, who had run interference for 48 hours from inside an institution she'd worked in for 8 years, who had sat in meetings with federal agents and redirected information and forged document trails and done it all with the unremarkable presence of a hospital administrator that nobody thought twice about. And somewhere in the architecture of what Howell had just told her, the funding mechanism, the off-book operations, there were people he hadn't named, officers, contractors, people up the chain who weren't in this room and weren't in federal custody and didn't yet know that Howell had just been walked out of a building in handcuffs. Tate, she called. He appeared in the doorway. Coulson, she said, right now, before anyone in the network gets word of what just happened here. Tate looked at her for a second, then at his phone. Then he stepped back into the corridor and she heard him talking. Ford said, "This is a significant soft tissue injury. You're not walking on this tonight." I know, Claire said. She did know. She also knew that it wasn't tonight she was worried about. It was the next 6 hours, while the network processed what had happened to its command structure and figured out what it was going to do about the documentation that was now moving toward a federal review board, and whether the people who hadn't been named yet were going to decide that containing the situation still meant containing the people who could speak to it. She was one of those people now. She had been, probably, for 4 years. She just hadn't known it until Rex sat down in a trauma bay and changed everything. Forday put a brace on her knee with the efficiency of someone who was doing the job they were trained for. And outside the door, In the corridor, she could hear the controlled urgent movement of a federal response expanding, more voices coming through, more vehicles arriving, and the particular frequency of an operation that had just cracked open something significant and was working very fast to manage what came out. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She'd thought that before. She answered. The voice was one she hadn't heard before, older, female, with the specific authority of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room they entered. Ms. Donovan, my name is Deputy Director Lena Marsh, Office of the Inspector General. I've been monitoring the Rourke operation from Washington for 72 hours. A pause. We have a problem that's larger than what's in that facility. I need you to listen carefully. Claire looked at Ford, who had finished the brace and was watching her face. I'm listening, Claire said. Howell was the operational commander, but the authorization for the network's expansion, the procurement contracts, the congressional access, the cover for the arms pipeline, came from higher, significantly higher. Another pause. Admiral Nathan Crowe, chairman of the Joint Chiefs Advisory Council, he became aware that Rourke was carrying documentation approximately 6 hours before the convoy departure. 6 hours. More than enough time to stage an interception. More than enough time to move Voss into position. More than enough time to compromise the route through Colson. And right now, Marsh continued, Admiral Crowe is not in Washington. He's in Fort Callum. Claire looked at the door of the medical bay. He flew in 2 hours ago, Marsh said. We believe he's moving to contain the situation personally, which means he's moving toward whatever location he believes Rourke is being held, which was here, this facility, whose location had been in every communication that went through Colson's office. How long? Claire said. We estimate 20 minutes. A pause. Ms. Donovan, my people are 40 minutes out. I need you to understand what I'm asking. She understood. 20 minutes with a compromised facility, a wounded patient, a federal team that didn't yet know the threat had changed shape, and a retired admiral with the resources and the motive to make sure that documentation never reached a review board. She stood up. Her knees screamed at her. She stood anyway. Tate, Claire said, loud enough to carry into the corridor. Get in here, now! He appeared in the doorway within 3 seconds, which told her his attention had been close. Crowe, she said. Admiral Nathan Crowe, he's in Fort Callum. Marsh says he's moving toward this facility. 20 minutes, maybe less. Tate went very still, in the way that trained people went still when they were processing something that required immediate action, and they didn't want to waste movement on the wrong response. Then he was on his radio before she finished the sentence, stepping back into the corridor, his voice dropping into the clipped frequency of someone running a rapid response. Claire looked at Ford. Can Rourke be moved? Not without significant risk to the chest tube placement. Define significant. Tension pneumothorax risk if the tube dislodges during transport. He needs another 6 hours minimum before I'd clear him for any vehicle movement. 6 hours, 20 minutes. The math was simple and terrible. They couldn't move him, which meant they had to hold the facility. She walked to the doorway. Her knee was wrong but functional, the brace doing enough of the work, and looked down the corridor. Tate was 10 meters away with 2 agents, the 3 of them clustered around a tactical map that someone had pulled up on a tablet. She counted the agents she could see. 7. More somewhere in the building. Whether that was enough depended entirely on what Crowe was bringing, and a man in his position with his resources and a 20-minute lead time could bring quite a lot. She went to Tate. He looked up from the tablet. Marsh's people are 40 minutes out, she said, keeping her voice below the general level of corridor noise. We have a window. I'm aware. What's the facility's defensible layout? He looked at her, then at the tablet, then made a decision that she could see him make. The decision to stop treating her as medical support and start treating her as someone who'd earned a different category. He turned the tablet so she could see it. Floor plan. Single building, 3 levels, the medical bay on the ground floor at the northeast corner. She studied it for 30 seconds. Service entrance east, main entrance south, vehicle access west. The west access was the approach problem. It was the widest entry point, and it connected directly to the main access road. If Crowe's people came in force, they'd come from there. Lock the west access, she said. Both vehicle barriers. You want a choke point, not an open approach. We don't have the personnel to hold 3 entry points. You don't hold 3. You close 2 and hold 1. South entrance, because it's the narrowest and it's away from the medical bay. Everything else, you make difficult. She looked at the northeast corner of the map. The medical bay has the service corridor on the east wall. That's where his people came through tonight. Secondary lock on that access and someone physically on the door. I have 6 agents available. 2 are managing Howell. Pull one off Howell. He's cuffed in an interior room. He's not a flight risk right now. She handed the tablet back. The priority is keeping Crow away from Rourke long enough for Marsh's team to arrive. 20 minutes becomes manageable if you control the geometry. Tate looked at her for a moment. You've done facility defense? I've done a lot of things, she said. Make the calls. He made the calls. She went back to the medical bay. Rourke was watching the door when she came in. Rex was standing now, not lying down, his body oriented toward the east wall with the animal's specific awareness of threat direction that she'd always found more reliable than most technical systems. Crow, Rourke said. He'd heard enough through the open door. Yes. He processed this with the particular flatness of a man who had spent the last 48 hours being shot at, cut open, sedated, woken up, and then subjected to an armed incursion in his hospital room, and had apparently decided somewhere in there that his capacity for surprise had reached its limit. He was always going to come himself, Rourke said. He doesn't trust delegation for the final step. You know him. I've worked around him for 2 years. He's the kind of commander who needs to be in the room when something gets closed. He looked at the ceiling. He's also the kind of man who's used to rooms getting closed the way he wants them closed. Fordu was restocking the emergency cart on the west wall, moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had decided that useful action was better than standing still. Marco was back on his feet. The hit he'd taken when the first team came through had left him with a laceration on his forehead that Ford had closed with 3 strips of tape, and he was moving carefully, but moving. The documentation, Claire said. Marsh said it's going to the review board. Is there any part of it that requires you to testify, that needs you present and speaking? Rourke turned his head to look at her. Why? Because if Crow's priority is silencing the documentation rather than recovering it, then the board receiving it doesn't fully close his exposure. He needs to know it can't be challenged, which means he needs to know you can't speak to it. Rourke was quiet for a moment. The primary evidence is digital. Authentication chain is intact. It doesn't need my testimony to be actionable. He paused. But Crow doesn't know that. His intelligence on the documentation status is whatever Coulson gave him, and Coulson's last reliable information was from the briefings before the convoy. So from his perspective, you're still the critical variable. From his perspective, yes. She thought about that, about a man who had built something over years carefully with the specific patience of someone who understood that large structures required long construction and who was now watching it come down in 48 hours because one lieutenant had gotten hold of the right files and had the presence of mind to get them out. People like that didn't accept the collapse. They tried to stop the last domino. Rourke was the last domino, as far as Crow knew. She positioned herself at the east wall beside the service door and settled in to wait. Crow didn't come in 20 minutes. He came in 11. She heard the west access alarm first, a brief electronic tone that cut off abruptly, which meant it had been overridden, not triggered, which meant someone with facility access codes. Coulson, who had had access to every federal communication routed through Harlow General, including whatever preliminary facility briefings had gone through the hospital's administrative system. Then the radio on her belt, Tate's frequency, crackled once, and she heard controlled movement in the corridor. Then a voice over the facility's internal speaker system, which meant someone had accessed the control room, which was on the second floor and shouldn't have been accessible from outside. This is Admiral Nathan Crow. The voice was measured, the kind of voice that had given orders for 30 years and had never developed any particular urgency about it, because urgency implied that outcomes were in doubt. I'm here on a matter of federal security. I need access to the medical bay immediately. Stand down. In the corridor, she heard Tate's voice, clipped. Admiral, this facility is under federal lockdown. I need you to... Agent Tate? Crow's voice still through the speaker. I outrank every person in this building. Stand down. With respect, sir, this is an OIG-directed operation, and I have direct instruction from Deputy Director Marsh. Marsh doesn't have jurisdiction here. I do. She heard the sound of the corridor situation changing. More footsteps, the specific density of a larger group moving, and the pause in Tate's voice that told her the numbers had shifted. Crow had brought enough people to make the conversation about something other than conversation. She looked at Ford. East corridor. Take Marco. There's a supply room 2 doors down. Go there and lock it. I'm not leaving my patient. You're not useful to your patient if you're in the room when this happens. She said it without heat. Go. Ford looked at Rourke. Go, he said. They went. She heard the door down the corridor close. Rex moved to stand beside Rourke's bed, and Claire took position at the medical bay entrance. Not in the doorway, to the side of it, because standing in a doorway was the tactical mistake that people made in movies and didn't make twice in the field. The south entrance held for 4 more minutes. She could hear it, the sounds of a standoff being negotiated by people with unequal leverage, Tate's agents buying time because that was what she'd asked them to do, until the weight of Crow's personnel advantage made holding the position untenable. Then the corridor went quiet in the specific way that meant a resolution had been reached, and the footsteps came toward the medical bay. Crow came through the door with 2 of his people flanking him, and the confident, unhurried movement of a man arriving somewhere he'd already decided was his. He was in his mid-60s, the kind of physical presence that had been maintained deliberately. Not large, but compact, with the posture of someone who'd been told their whole career that posture mattered, and had internalized it so completely it no longer looked like effort. He wore a dark jacket over civilian clothes. No insignia. He'd been careful about that. He looked at Rourke. He looked at Rex. He looked at Claire. She watched him process her. The scrubs, the vest, the brace on her knee, the fact that she was the only person standing between him and the patient. And she watched him decide, in the way that men who'd held significant power for a long time sometimes decided, that she was not the primary problem in the room. That was the mistake. Lieutenant Rourke, Crow said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been on the speaker. Measured, the temperature of a man presenting an option rather than making a threat. The documentation you're carrying is going to cause a great deal of harm to a great deal of people who have done important work for this country. I'd like you to consider what that means. The documentation left my possession 2 days ago, Rourke said. I told you, it's already moving. To a review board that can be slowed. Processes can be redirected. He stepped forward, just slightly. What can't be redirected is the human testimony of the people involved. That's what we're discussing. You're discussing witness intimidation, Claire said. Crow looked at her properly for the first time. You're the nurse. Yes. You've had a long couple of days. I have. You should step back. This doesn't concern you. I've been told that a few times in the last 48 hours, she said. It's kept being wrong. Something shifted in Crow's expression, so not anger, more like the specific recalibration of someone who had encountered unexpected friction and was adjusting their assessment of the obstacle. His 2 people had fanned out slightly, covering the room angles with the practiced positioning of men who'd done this before. Rex had not moved. He was between the 2 men in Rourke's bed, and he was doing the thing he'd been doing in the trauma bay 2 days ago. Not aggressive, not reactive, simply present in a way that communicated the absolute certainty of his position. Ma'am, Crow said, still measured, I'm going to ask you one more time. No, she said. He looked at his people. She spoke before they moved. The documentation has already been distributed, she said, not just to the review board. Copies went to 3 independent federal journalists at 12:07 this morning. Deputy Director Marsh authorized it as a contingency against exactly this kind of intervention. The room was quiet. She watched it land on Crow, the specific quality of a man absorbing information that dismantles a calculation he'd built a plan around. Not panic. Crow wasn't the kind of man who panicked, but the stillness that came after, the half-second where he was recalculating in real time, was the first time she'd seen him without complete certainty in his posture. She didn't know for certain that Marsh had distributed the documentation to journalists. Marsh had told her the documentation was going to the review board. She had extrapolated the rest from the logic of the situation and the things Marsh had said about anticipating Crow's response. It was possible she was wrong. She held Crow's gaze and didn't let him see the possibility. "You're speculating," he said. "Call Marsh," she said. "Ask her." He didn't call, because calling Marsh meant confirming whether the fallback he'd been counting on, containing the documentation at the review board level, was already gone, and men like Crow didn't make calls that removed their remaining options until they were certain those options were gone. The delay was enough. Tate came through the south entrance. He came in fast with 4 agents and the specific energy of someone who'd regrouped and was running on the particular fury of a professional who'd been pushed out of his own operation by a superior's leverage and had spent the last 6 minutes making sure that leverage was gone. He had his credentials out and his weapon up, and he said, without preamble, "Admiral Crow, you are under federal detention pending investigation under 18 U.S.C. 1512, witness tampering, and 18 U.S.C. 371, conspiracy. Do not move." Crow's 2 people looked at the 4 agents and made the calculation that people made when the math changed. They didn't move. Crow looked at Tate. He looked at the agents. He looked at Claire. And in that look she saw something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not desperation, but a kind of cold assessment. The look of a man deciding which version of the next 10 minutes was least damaging to whatever remained salvageable. He made a choice. "I want my attorney," he said. "You'll have one," Tate said. "Hands." Crow put his hands out. He was cuffed with the same controlled efficiency that Tate brought to everything, and he was walked toward the south entrance. And he walked with the posture of a man who had not yet accepted that walking out of this room in handcuffs was the permanent shape of the next chapter of his life. She watched him go. Rex sat down. Rourke exhaled from the bed. A long, controlled breath, the sound of a man who'd been holding something tight for a very long time. "Is it done?" he said. She thought about what done meant. Crow's in custody. Howell in custody. Voss in custody. The documentation moving. The journalists, if Marsh had made that call, and she was increasingly certain Marsh had made that call, because Marsh had been monitoring for 72 hours, and Marsh was the kind of person who didn't leave a single point of failure. "The big part," she said. "Yes." He nodded. His eyes closed. His hand rested on Rex's head where the dog had pushed up against the mattress edge, and she watched his monitors flatten into the steady rhythm of a man who was hurt and exhausted and had finally been allowed to stop. She sat down because her knee had reached the end of its tolerance for standing, and she needed to be honest with herself about that. 40 appeared in the doorway, assessed the room, and came in with the expression of someone resuming work that had been temporarily interrupted by someone else's crisis. "Your knee," Ford said. "I know. You need imaging." "After." "After what?" Claire didn't answer immediately. After was a large territory, and she hadn't mapped it yet. After Marsh's team arrived. After the prisoners were properly processed. After whatever accounting happened for Coulson, who was still at Harlow General, as far as she knew, who had sat in the center of a federal operation for 2 days and fed information to a man who'd just been walked out of a building in handcuffs. After she figured out what happened next to the 8 years she'd built in a specific manageable lane that had just been permanently altered. Tate came back through the door without his jacket, which meant the jacket was somewhere in the corridor handling a problem, and looked at her with the expression he'd been developing over the last several hours, the one that was still adjusting its category for her. "Marsh's team is 15 minutes out," he said. "Crow and Howell are in secure holding on separate floors. Voss is being transferred to federal custody." A pause. "And we have Coulson." She looked up. "Local FBI picked him up at the hospital 12 minutes ago. He was in his office. He had a bag packed." Tate's voice was flat, in the way that professional flatness sometimes barely covered something harder underneath. "He's asking for immunity." "He's not getting it," she said. "No, he's not." Tate leaned against the doorframe. "You told me Veld was clean." "Yes." Our analyst confirmed it. The spoofed account originated from Coulson's personal device. Veld had no access to the root document. He looked at her steadily. "You called that in the interview room before we had the metadata." "Veld is a difficult man," she said. "He's not a dishonest one. There's a difference." Tate nodded slowly. He looked at Rourke, who was asleep, then at Rex, who was lying at the foot of the bed. "What happens to the dog?" "His handler is recovering at a VA facility in Richmond. When Rourke is stable enough for transfer, Rex goes with him and then returns to his handler. She paused. That's how it should work. And you? She looked at the question. It was a reasonable question. It was the question she'd been not quite asking herself for 48 hours, because the operational present had provided enough immediate problems to keep the future at a distance. Now the immediate problems had names, and those names were in federal custody, and the future was available for consideration, and she wasn't entirely sure what she thought about it. I need to sleep, she said. After that, I don't know yet. He accepted that. He left. She sat in the medical bay with the monitors and the dog and the sleeping soldier and the institutional beige of the walls and the fluorescent hum of the lights. And she let herself be somewhere between the thing she'd been for 4 years and the thing she'd apparently been all along. Marsh arrived at 0340. She was not what Claire had imagined from the voice. Younger, maybe 52, with the kind of face that suggested she'd been doing hard work for a long time and had stopped performing anything about it. She came in with 6 people, and the specific efficient gravity of someone who understood that the scene she was walking into was the end of a very long sequence and needed to be handled with precision. She found Claire in the corridor outside the medical bay, sitting against the wall on the floor because the chairs were in the debrief room and the floor was available. Marsh looked at the knee brace, the vest over the scrubs, the state of things generally, and sat down on the floor next to her without comment. That earned her a significant amount of Claire's respect. The distribution, Claire said. The journalists, did you authorize that? At 11:42, Marsh said, 3 outlets. 2 received confirmation of delivery before Crow entered the facility. She glanced at Claire. You used it as a bluff. I used it as a probability. It held. Yes. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, her team was moving through the facility with the organized thoroughness of people who had a lot of work to do and understood the timeline. I've been watching this case for 14 months, she said. Rourke was our primary, but there were others feeding into the picture. It took Rourke getting hit on that extraction and ending up in a trauma bay in Fort Callum to crack the outer layer. She looked at her hands. If that dog hadn't responded to you, the whole thing might have closed differently. Was saying. Rex made a decision, Claire said. I just followed it. That's a modest reading. It's an accurate one. Marsh looked at her with the assessing directness that had been there from the beginning of the phone call. I've read your file. The real one. Howell said he sealed it. He sealed one version. The OIG maintained a parallel record. A pause. What you did overseas when... The operation that went wrong 4 years ago. The reason you were moved out of active status. You were protecting 3 people whose covers were about to be blown by the same network we've been dismantling. You got them out. Nobody ever formally credited that. Claire looked at the opposite wall. I know. It's going to be part of the official record now. She didn't say anything. I also want to talk to you, Marsh said, about what comes next. Not tonight. When you've slept and had your knee properly imaged and eaten something that isn't from a vending machine. She stood up from the floor with the slight effort of a person who'd been doing this job for 20 years. But there are things the OIG is going to need that require someone with your particular background. And there are people in this network whose names aren't on any of the documents we've recovered tonight who are going to need to be found. Claire looked up at her. Think about it, Marsh said, and walked away down the corridor. She slept for 4 hours on a cot in an office on the 2nd floor, with her knee elevated on a rolled jacket, and Rex outside the door because someone had walked him up there, and he decided that was where he was staying. When she woke up, it was light outside, gray morning light through a window that hadn't been cleaned recently, and she lay still for a moment and let the previous 48 hours settle into their actual shape. Crow, Howell, Voss, Coulson, Rourke alive, asleep in the medical bay below her with his chest tube draining and his monitors steady. Rex outside the door, his nails clicking once on the concrete when she moved on the cot, recognizing the specific sound of someone waking up. She got up. It took a moment with the knee. She opened the door and Rex looked at her with his ears forward and his whole body expressing the question of what happened next. Good question, she told him. She went downstairs. The facility was quieter now. Marsh's team had processed through the night, And what was left was the particular stillness of aftermath, people doing the careful work that followed the urgent work. She checked on Rourke. Ford had been there since dawn, adjusting his fluid balance, monitoring the lung. The drainage had decreased overnight, which was the right direction. She checked Rourke's chart, made 2 notes that Ford acknowledged without looking up, and then stood at the foot of his bed for a moment. He was asleep, but a light sleep. She could see it in the way his eyes moved. She didn't wake him. He'd earned whatever rest he could get. She went to the debrief room, where Tate was working at the table with 3 other agents, case files spread in front of them, the particular organized chaos of people building a prosecutorial record. He looked up. "How's the knee?" "It's been worse." "Imaging?" "After coffee." He pointed at a coffee maker in the corner that she hadn't noticed because she'd been otherwise occupied the last time she was in this room. She poured a cup and sat down across from him. "Coulson," she said, "cooperating. He's given us 2 names we didn't have, mid-level procurement officers who facilitated the arms transfers. He's also confirmed the timeline of how the network accessed the facility information." Tate picked up a printed page. "He was turned 18 months ago. Crow's people came to him with evidence of a financial irregularity in the hospital's capital fund. Nothing enormous, but enough to be career-ending if surfaced. He made a choice. He chose wrong." "He did." Tate put the page down. "The hospital board has been notified. There will be an administrative process." She thought about Harlow General, the trauma bay, the nurses' station where she'd been charting when Peggy came around the corner with that look, the locker room where Veld had asked her questions she hadn't answered properly. 8 years of a life she'd built around the idea that staying small and staying still was the safest way to stay intact. "Veld," she said, "is being contacted by the federal team this morning. He'll be informed that he's cleared and that the leak originated with Coulson." Tate looked at her. "He's been asking about you. Not to us, to Peggy Adler, apparently. She's been getting calls." "What is he asking?" "Whether you're safe." She absorbed that. Marcus Veld, who had told her to stay in her lane and called her a liability and stood in her locker room asking questions, had been calling Peggy Adler to ask if she was safe. People were complicated. She knew that. She'd always known that. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. Tate nodded. He reached into the file in front of him and slid a folder across the table. She looked at it, her name on the tab, her real file, the OIG parallel record that Marsh had mentioned. "Marsh asked me to give you that," he said, "for your review. Not for discussion, not yet. Just for your information." She didn't open it immediately. She looked at it the way you looked at something you'd been carrying without knowing its shape for 4 years, and now it was in front of you, and you could finally see the edges. She opened it. The first page was her service record, the complete version, not the partial one in the hospital system. The second page was an operational summary for the extraction she'd run 4 years ago, the 3 covers she'd protected, the network she'd inadvertently documented by being in the wrong place with the right instincts. The summary was clinical and precise and credited her by name, which she hadn't known. She'd assumed the official record attributed it to the operation broadly. The third page was a list of names. She recognized some of them. Military leadership, 3 contractors, a congressional staffer. The names she'd expected to see, the ones that corresponded to what Howell had told her about the network 4 years ago. Then the fourth page. New names. The expansion Rourke's documentation had exposed. More officers, more contractors. Several names she didn't recognize, and one that she did, a name that appeared in congressional records in connection with a Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. A name she'd heard on a radio news segment 2 years ago in a context that had seemed entirely unrelated. A name that sat on the 4th page of her OIG file and suggested that the network Crow had commanded was larger than even Marsh had indicated on the phone. She looked up from the file. Tate was watching her. Not with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction, with the expression of someone who'd already had the reaction and was past it. "How many?" she said. "The full scope is still being mapped. What we have documented so far is..." He paused. "Significant. Significant." She thought about what Marsh had said about people whose names weren't on the documents they'd recovered, about the work that would need to be done to find them. She looked back at the 4th page. The name she recognized. The subcommittee, the defense appropriations process, which meant procurement, which meant the network hadn't just been running arms, it had been shaping the contracts that determined which weapon systems got funded, which contractors got the work, and who inside the military advisory structure had the leverage to direct both. Crow had been the operational commander, but what she was looking at on the fourth page was the financial architecture, and the financial architecture suggested someone above Crow, someone who'd been in the system long enough to build a procurement influence network across multiple administrations, someone whose name she now knew. She closed the file. "Marsh knows about the fourth page," she said. "Yes." "This is why she wants to talk to me." "Yes." She sat with the coffee that had gone cold and the file that had just rearranged her understanding of the size of what they'd broken open, and thought about the conversation she hadn't had with Marsh yet, and what it would involve, and whether she was willing to let herself be pulled back into the world she'd spent 4 years deliberately leaving. Rex pushed through the door of the debrief room. Nobody had opened it. The latch was a lever handle, and he'd learned lever handles somewhere in his training, and he walked across the room and put his chin on the table in front of her with the uncomplicated directness of an animal who had decided where he was supposed to be and acted accordingly. She put her hand on his head. "I know," she said. They brought Rourke out of the medical bay at noon, not for transport, but to a sitting position, which Ford had cleared as a cautious first step. He was pale and moved carefully and had the chest tube taped to his side with the portable drainage unit clipped to the hospital gown they'd found for him. And he looked, overall, like a man who had been through something serious and was the first to know it. He sat in the chair that Marco had set up near the window, because Ford had said light was good and windows were available, and Rex arranged himself at his feet with the immediate rightness of an animal, returning to its correct position. Claire sat across from him. "Marsh talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "She'll offer you something." "She already has, generally." He looked at the window. The light was flat and gray, the kind of winter morning that didn't commit to anything. "The thing Howell said, in the medical bay, about the network being a funding mechanism, about off-book operations." He looked back at her. "That's the argument they always make, that the ends justify the structure, that what they're doing is necessary and the official channels are too slow or too watched or too constrained." He paused. "The documentation doesn't just show the arms transfers. It shows who those arms went to and what they were used for. Some of it isn't—" He stopped. "It's not a clean picture. It never is." "No." He looked at his hands. "But it's true. That's the part that matters. It's documented and it's true. And now it's in 3 journalists' hands, and with the OIG and the review board, and however ugly the picture is, it's going to be on the record." He looked at her. "That's what I was carrying, not just the network structure, the record of what it actually did." She understood what he was telling her, why it had been worth it, why he'd taken the risks he'd taken and ended up on a gurney in a trauma bay in Fort Callum with a collapsed lung and a military working dog standing on his chest. Because some things needed to be on the record. She understood that better than she'd wanted to, once. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She almost made a joke about it. She answered, "Ms. Donovan." A male voice, older, measured. Not Marsh. Not anyone she'd spoken to in the last 48 hours. "My name is Senator Douglas Pratt. I'm the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I've been briefed this morning by Deputy Director Marsh on the situation in Fort Callum." She said nothing. "I understand you played a significant role in securing the documentation and the arrest of Admiral Crow." A pause. "I also understand you've seen the 4th page of the OIG file." Something went very still inside her. "Senator," she said carefully. "The name on the 4th page," Pratt said. "I want you to know that we are aware of it, and the committee has been building a separate investigation for 7 months. Another pause. "I'm telling you this because Marsh tells me you are someone who operates on accurate information. And the accurate information is that what you've done in the last 48 hours has given that separate investigation what it needed to move." She looked at Rourke, who was watching her face. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing tonight," Pratt said. "Rest. Get your knee looked at, but in the next week, I'd like to request your presence before a closed session of the committee." A pause. as a witness, and possibly as something more than that. Something more than that.
She thought about the lane, the 8 years of careful smallness, the locker room and the nurse's station, and the chart she'd been updating when Peggy came around the corner. The life she'd built around the specific premise that staying invisible was the same as staying safe. She thought about Rex sitting down in a trauma bay and looking at her like she was someone he'd been waiting for. She thought about the 4th page. "I'll call Marsh," she said.
Good. Pratt's voice shifted slightly. Less formal, more direct. "Ms. Donovan, the name on that page is not someone who's going to accept what happened to Crow and Howell quietly. They're going to move to contain it." "How quickly?" A brief silence. "They may already be moving," he said. She lowered the phone and looked across the room at Tate, who had appeared in the doorway with the expression she'd been seeing all morning. The one that was running a rapid calculation about something he hadn't expected. He was holding his phone. He looked at her. "Coulson," he said, "in federal custody. He had a secondary communication device we didn't find in the initial search. He sent 3 messages before we located it." His voice was flat and controlled. "We don't know to whom. We don't know what they said, but the messages went out 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes. She looked at Rourke. She looked at Rex. She looked at the file still sitting on the table with the 4th page inside it, and the name she now knew, and the 40 minutes she didn't have back. "We need to move him," she said. "Ford says—" "I know what Ford says. We need to move him anyway." She was already standing. Whoever Coulson contacted, the only reason to send messages now is to tell them where Rourke is, which means this location is burned. Again. She looked at Tate with the specific directness that had replaced the 8 years of careful smallness, because the careful smallness was done, and she knew it, and she was done pretending otherwise. "Get me a transport. Get me a real one this time. And get Marsh on the line, because we have 40 minutes and a name on a 4th page that just started moving." Tate was on his radio before she finished the sentence. The next 4 minutes were controlled chaos. The specific organized version of chaos that happened when trained people received bad information and had to rebuild a plan faster than the plan was designed to move. Marsh came on the line while Claire was back in the medical bay helping Ford assess whether Rourke could tolerate movement, and Marsh's voice had the particular quality of someone who had been running contingencies in her head since the moment Coulson was taken into custody and had known, on some level, that a secondary device was always possible. "Where do you want him?" Marsh said. "Somewhere that doesn't exist in any communication that went through Harlow General or this facility in the last 72 hours, Claire said. "Somewhere Coulson has never heard of." "I have a location. Medical staff on site. It's a federal safe house with an infirmary. Not ideal for his level of injury, but functional." A pause. 20 minutes from your position. I need 15 to get my team moving." "You have 10, Claire said. "We don't know when Coulson's messages were sent or how fast the response will be." "Understood." She put the phone down and looked at Ford. Ford was looking at Rourke's chest tube with the expression of a physician doing a real-time risk calculation that had no good answer, only a least bad one. "If the tube dislodges during transport," Ford started. "I know the risk," Claire said. "Tell me what I need to manage it." Fordy looked at her for a moment, then made the decision that people who worked in medicine eventually made when the clinical ideal became unavailable. The decision to work with what was possible rather than mourning what wasn't. She pulled a supply kit from the cabinet and began talking, precise and fast, about what to watch for and what to do when. Claire listened. She remembered everything. That was one of the things about field medicine. You learned to carry information in your hands and your instincts, not just your head, because in the moments when you needed it most, there was no time to look anything up. Rourke was watching them both with the alert exhaustion of a man who understood his body was the object of this conversation and had accepted that his role was to cooperate rather than direct. Rex was already on his feet, reading the room's energy with the precision of an animal calibrated to exactly this kind of shift. "I can walk," Rourke said. "You absolutely cannot," Ford said. "I can walk badly," he said. "That's different." "You will be in a wheelchair, and you will be quiet about it," Claire said. He was quiet about it. Well, the transport was a medical van, not a government vehicle. Marsh's people had sourced it from a local medical supply company in the kind of rapid procurement that required resources Claire didn't want to think about the cost of. It had a proper gurney mount and enough equipment to manage a critical patient in transit, and it looked like something that belonged on any road in Virginia rather than something that announced itself as a federal operation. They loaded Rourke in 7 minutes. Claire rode in the back with Ford, who had refused to stay behind with the specific quiet stubbornness of a physician who decided her patient wasn't going anywhere without her. Rex got in without being asked. Tate drove. 2 of Marsh's agents followed in a separate vehicle. The facility disappeared behind them in the gray morning, and Claire kept her eyes on Rourke's monitors and her hand near the drainage unit and let the road noise fill in the silence that none of them had the energy to fill with words. They made it to the safe house in 18 minutes. Nothing happened on the road. She didn't trust that. She noted it, the absence of contact, the clear road, the safe arrival, and filed it under information that needed context before it meant anything. Sometimes nothing happened because the threat hadn't responded yet. Sometimes nothing happened because the threat had changed shape and was looking for a different angle. She didn't relax until they had Rourke inside, on a proper bed, with monitors running and the chest tube properly secured, and Ford doing a full assessment with the thoroughness of someone who was going to account for every minute of the last hour's movement. Then she stepped outside into the cold air and stood on the narrow concrete step at the safe house's rear entrance and breathed. The sky was the same gray it had been all morning, the specific low ceiling of a Virginia winter that never quite committed to weather. Her knee was throbbing in the steady, persistent way of an injury that had been managing on borrowed tolerance for too long. She was wearing scrubs that were now more than 36 hours old and a tactical vest over them, and she had not eaten anything that required a plate since she couldn't remember when. She was also, she realized, the least afraid she'd been in 4 years. That was a strange thing to notice standing on a concrete step in the cold, but it was true. The fear that had structured her last 4 years, the low, constant, managed fear of being found, of being seen, of being pulled back into something she'd decided to leave, was gone, or at least changed into something that didn't operate on her the same way. Because she'd been found, and she'd been seen, and she'd been pulled back in, and she was still standing. That wasn't the same as saying everything was fine. Her knee disagreed with fine. Her knee had strong opinions about fine. But the specific fear was gone, and in its place was something more like clarity. The uncomfortable kind, the kind that shows you the shape of a choice you've been postponing. Marsh's voice came from the doorway behind her. She'd come in separately, 15 minutes after the van, and Claire hadn't spoken to her since the phone call. "The name on the 4th page," Marsh said. "Franklin Ardell." Claire turned. She'd known it was coming. "Yes. He's been in his position for 11 years, 3 administrations. He's chaired the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee for 6 of those years, which means he has a direct line to every major procurement decision in that window." Marsh came out onto the step and let the door close. Crow was the operational arm. Ardell was the financial architecture. He never touched the arms transfers directly. He shaped the environment that made them possible and profitable. And the 4th page documents that. Enough to open a formal investigation, not enough yet to guarantee prosecution. Marsh looked at the gray sky. Rourke's documentation fills several gaps, but Ardell has spent 11 years building institutional relationships and procedural distance from anything operational. He's going to be very difficult to prosecute without testimony from people who can speak to the chain of instruction. People like Howell. Howell is going to negotiate. That's already started. Marsh's voice was measured. He'll give us Ardell in exchange for reduced exposure on the network charges. His attorney made contact this morning. Will it be enough? If Howell's testimony is corroborated. She looked at Claire directly. There are 2 other people who can provide that corroboration. One is in Rourke's documentation, a contractor who ran the procurement side of the transfers. We're locating him. A pause. The other is you. I didn't know about Ardell 4 years ago. No. But you know about the operation that you were pulled from. You know the shape of the network as it was then, and you know what you witnessed. That testimony, placed alongside Howell's and the contractors in Rourke's documentation, creates a corroborating record that makes Ardell prosecutable. Marsh's voice was direct but not pressured. I'm not asking you to do something you're not willing to do. I'm telling you what your testimony would mean. The cold air moved between them. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed on the main highway. Ordinary, distant, a sound from the world that was continuing without any knowledge of this step or this conversation. Senator Pratt mentioned a closed session, Claire said. Yes, that would be the preliminary step. Closed, protected, on the record. Marsh looked at her. After that, if the committee pursues formal charges, there may be public testimony down the line. Public. She turned this word over. The opposite of invisible. The opposite of the specific bounded lane she'd built her life inside. Give me until tomorrow, she said. You have it. Marsh went back inside. Claire stayed on the step for another minute, and then she went back in too because it was cold and her knee was talking to her in a language she couldn't ignore much longer, and because Rourke was in there and Rex was in there, and the work that still needed doing was in there, and she'd learned a long time ago that postponing wasn't the same as deciding. The next 36 hours moved differently than the previous 48. Slower, but denser. The urgent operational pace had given way to the grinding procedural work of a federal investigation taking its shape, and that work had its own pressure. Less like running towards something and more like holding a structure together while people built it around you. Ardell released a statement through his office at 7 in the morning, 2 days after Crow's arrest. She read it on Tate's phone in the infirmary while Ford checked Rourke's chest tube, which was showing good progress. The lung was re-expanding on schedule, the drainage had reduced to a trickle overnight, and Ford was using the word encouraging with the careful qualification of a physician who'd learned not to overcommit. The statement said Ardell was aware of federal investigations into Department of Defense procurement practices and was fully cooperating with all oversight processes. It said he had no knowledge of any illegal activity within the networks under his committee's jurisdiction. It said he was confident that a thorough review would confirm his integrity. It was the statement of a man who had been doing this for 11 years and knew exactly how to construct a public position that gave him room to maneuver. He's establishing the narrative, Tate said when she handed the phone back. Yes, she'd watched people do it before. The preemptive positioning, the language of cooperation that was actually the language of containment. Is Pratt moving? The committee announced this morning that it's opening a formal inquiry into defense procurement irregularities. Bipartisan, which Ardell didn't see coming. He had 3 ranking members he thought were aligned. Tate pocketed his phone. The announcement named no individuals. Ardell's name isn't in it yet. But it's coming. It's coming. She thought about the difference between those two things. The announcement and the arrival of the name. The space between them was where Ardell was working right now, and she understood what he was doing in that space, and she made her decision in the same moment she understood it. She called Marsh. The closed session, she said. When? I can have you before the committee in 72 hours. Do it. A silence, brief. Are you sure? If I wait, he uses the time. I'd rather use it first. All right. Marsh's voice shifted into operational mode. I'll need a full debrief from you before the session. Everything from 4 years ago. The operation, what you saw, the extraction, the names, all of it. I know. I'll also need you to be formally represented. Counsel, someone you trust. I'll find someone. She didn't have someone immediately available, but she knew people. Cautiously, at a distance, the connections she'd maintained even in the lane because some connections were too important to sever completely. She made 2 calls. The second one gave her a name, a federal defense attorney in Washington who had a reputation for working cases that most people decided were too complicated to touch. She called the number. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Okafor, picked up on the 3rd ring and listened to a 30-second summary without interrupting. Then she said, "When's the session?" 72 hours. A pause. That's fast. Yes. I'll be there in 12. Another pause. Don't talk to anyone about the substance of your testimony before I arrive. Understood. She hung up and went to sit with Rourke, because he was awake and the infirmary was small, and she could tell from the way he was positioned in the bed that he'd been thinking in the specific active way of someone who had too much horizontal time and not enough information. You're going to testify, he said. Yes. He nodded. He looked at the ceiling. I've been doing this kind of work for 6 years, he said. Carrying things. Getting things to the people who need them. And most of the time, nothing happens with what I deliver.
It goes into a process, and the process moves slowly, and the people I was up against have more lawyers and more time and more institutional cover than the process can handle. He paused. This one's different. Because of Ardell? Because of the breadth. The documentation covers 3 years and 4 procurement cycles, and it names names at every level from contractor up. That's not something you bury in a procedural delay. He looked at her. And because the people who are going to testify are people they can't discredit. He said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment, just as an assessment. They'll try, she said. They always try. He shifted slightly, cautiously, the movement of a man relearning where his body's edges were. But you spent 8 years as a floor nurse at a mid-sized hospital. You treated patients, and you kept your head down, and you built a life that was completely ordinary. And then when it mattered, you did what you did. He looked at her with the specific directness of someone who'd been in enough situations to know the difference between performed competence and the real thing. That's not something a defense attorney can take apart. That's just who you are. She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it for a moment, and then she said, "How are you actually feeling?" He was quiet for a second, surprised by the shift. Then, "Like someone put a hole in my lung." "Yes," she said, "that's accurate." He almost smiled. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it, and it changed his face into something younger and less armored. "When do they let me out of this bed?" "Ford says another 48 hours before she'll clear you for minimal movement. Surgery in 5 to 7 days, depending on how the lung progresses." "And Rex?" She looked at the dog, who was stretched out under the bed with his chin on the floor and his eyes half open. "He stays with you until you're transferred to a proper facility. Then he goes back to his handler." Rourke looked at the space under the bed where Rex was visible as a shadow and a pair of ears. "Good dog," he said quietly. Not to Claire, just to the room. Rex's tail moved once. A single, slow wag. Nice. Sandra Okafor arrived at 11 that night, which was 12 hours after she said she'd be there, exactly. She was compact and direct, and wore the specific expression of someone who had decided before she walked through the door that she was not going to be surprised by anything she encountered, and held to that expression through the briefing with the focused attention of someone who processed information fast and didn't need things repeated. They worked until 3 in the morning. Okafor asked questions Claire hadn't thought to anticipate, which was the point of having counsel, the questions that came from outside your own frame of reference. The things you knew so well you'd stopped seeing them as things that needed explaining. By the end, she had a shape for the testimony, not scripted. Okafor was explicit that scripted testimony fell apart under pressure, and she didn't build her cases on scripts, but structured. The sequence of events, the chain of observation, the specific details that constituted evidence versus context versus inference. The things to say and the things to redirect. "They're going to ask about your time at Harlow General," Okafor said near the end. "Why you chose that particular hospital, that particular city, whether your presence there was operational." "It wasn't. I was living my life." "I know. You need to be able to say that in a way that doesn't sound defensive, because the moment you sound defensive about the 8 years, they'll spend a week on the 8 years instead of the network." "How do I say it?" Okafor looked at her. "Exactly how it's true. You left an operational world that had consumed everything, and you built something ordinary because ordinary was what you needed. People do that. It's not complicated. The complication comes when you try to justify it, because then it sounds like there's something to justify." Claire thought about that for a long time after Okafor left the room. The closed session before the Senate Armed Services Committee's Special Inquiry Panel took place in a federal building in Washington 3 days later, in a room that was smaller than she'd expected and quieter, with the specific quality of rooms where significant things were decided in the absence of any audience to witness the deciding. Pratt was there, at the head of the table, 4 other committee members, a legal staff, court reporters. Marsh, in the corner, not speaking. Okafor sat beside her. Claire testified for 4 hours. She was not, she discovered, afraid in the room. She'd expected something like the fear she'd carried for 4 years, the low constant management of exposure, but what she felt instead was the particular quality of focus that had always come to her when the situation was clear and the task was defined. The testimony was a task. She was good at tasks.
She spoke about what she'd seen 4 years ago. The operation, the names she'd known, the network's shape as it had existed then. She spoke about the extraction she'd run, the 3 people she'd gotten out, the evidence she'd collected without knowing she was collecting it. She spoke about the decision to step away and the conversation that had framed it as a choice when it was, she understood now, closer to a managed removal. She spoke about Rex in the trauma bay, about Rourke on the gurney, about the 48 hours that had followed, methodically and accurately, and without the defensive justifications that Okafor had warned her against. She spoke about Howell, about Crow, about Coulson and Voss and the specific mechanics of how the network had operated inside the institutions that were supposed to constrain it. And when one of the committee members, a man named Senator Galloway, who asked questions with the particular quality of someone looking for a crack to push on, said, "Ms. Donovan, you have a classified military record that was sealed by individuals who are now under federal indictment. How do we know that your account of events isn't shaped by whatever relationship existed between you and those individuals?" She looked at him steadily and said, "Because I spent 4 years as a floor nurse at a mid-sized hospital in Virginia, treating patients who had nothing to do with any of this. And the only reason I'm in this room is that a military working dog sat down in a trauma bay and the man on the gurney needed someone to keep him alive. I didn't come looking for this. It came for me. And when it did, I made the choices I made because the alternative was to let a wounded soldier die and a network keep operating, and I wasn't willing to do either of those things." She paused. "You can look at my patient outcomes for 8 years at Harlow General. You can look at every shift I worked and every chart I filed and every decision I made in that hospital. That's the record of the person I've been. It doesn't need defending." Bucket. Galloway didn't follow up. The session ran until the afternoon. When it was over and she came out into a corridor that smelled like old carpet and recycled air, Okafor walked beside her and said quietly, "Good." That was all. But from Okafor, she understood, good covered a significant range. The formal charges against Franklin Ardell were filed 11 days later. She was back at the safe house when it happened, still managing Rourke's recovery, still in the particular limbo of an aftermath that hadn't fully resolved itself into the next thing. She saw the news on Tate's laptop, a live feed from the Capitol steps where a joint statement from the OIG and the Department of Justice was being read into a crowd of cameras that was larger than she'd seen for any story in years. Ardell's name. The charges: conspiracy, bribery, obstruction, and accessory to arms trafficking across international borders. The 11 years. The procurement cycles. The funding mechanism that addressed itself in the language of national security and operated through the machinery of legitimate oversight for more than a decade. Beside his name, eventually, Howells, Crows, Vosses, Coulsons. A chain of accountability, public and documented, in the specific daylight that these things needed to mean anything permanent. She watched it without the satisfaction she'd expected, which was itself a kind of honesty. This was the right outcome. It was not a clean outcome. Clean outcomes were things that happened in stories that had simplified themselves, and this had not simplified. People had been hurt. Rourke had nearly died. The 3 operatives she'd extracted 4 years ago had lived undercover for 4 years because of a network that was now, finally, on the record. That was a real cost, paid by real people, and no set of charges on a federal document undid it. But it was on the record. That was real, too. Rourke had said it, and she'd understood it then, and she understood it more fully now. Some things needed to be on the record, and the record was the difference between justice as an aspiration and justice as an event that happened to actual people in actual time. Tate sat next to her on the infirmary couch where she'd been sleeping for the last week and said nothing for a while, watching the feed. Then he said, "Harlow General called." She looked at him. "The board. They want to speak with you." He didn't look at her directly. "The federal investigation cleared all staff except Coulson. The hospital's been publicly notified." A pause. "Veld apparently went on record with the board about your clinical performance during the initial Rourke admission. He submitted a written account." Veld described your response as, I'm quoting, "the single most competent triage intervention I have witnessed in 23 years of trauma medicine." Tate's voice was scrupulously neutral. He also noted that the hospital failed to recognize your qualifications appropriately, and that this failure was institutional rather than individual. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus Veld, who had told her to stay in her lane, who had called her a liability, who had stood in her locker room and asked questions with the particular confidence of a man who was always the most qualified person in the room, and who had turned out to be both infuriating and, in the end, honest enough to say in writing what he'd seen. People were complicated. She kept being right about that. "What does the board want?" she asked. "To formally apologize and to offer you a position." Tate paused. "Not floor nurse, clinical director of emergency trauma. Full authority over protocols, staffing, and continuing education for the department." She absorbed that. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "I know." She didn't decide then. She sat with it in the way she'd been sitting with all the decisions of the last 2 weeks. Not avoiding them, but giving them the space to be real before she answered. That was something she'd learned the hard way. The difference between a decision made under pressure because you had to decide and a decision made because you'd actually looked at what you were choosing. Rourke was cleared for surgery 9 days after arriving at the safe house. The procedure happened at a federal medical facility in Washington. Proper surgical suite, proper anesthesia team, proper post-op care. Ford transferred his case with a handoff document that was 3 pages long and annotated in the specific, precise way of a physician who wanted to make absolutely sure the next team understood what they were inheriting. Claire rode in the transport with him one last time, and when they wheeled them in, she stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite and waited in the way that she'd waited outside 1,000 surgical suites over 8 years of shifts, the particular quality of waiting that was useful rather than anxious. He came out 4 hours later. The surgery had gone well. The term the surgeon used was uncomplicated, which in surgical language meant everything went as planned without the specific surprises that surgical situations frequently produced. She sat with him when he was in recovery, mostly asleep. His breathing, finally the steady, unguarded rhythm of a body that had been given permission to repair itself. Rex was in the corridor outside. The facility had a policy about animals in recovery, which Claire had been informed of and had acknowledged, and which Rex had then violated by positioning himself directly outside the door with the specific immovability of an animal that had decided a policy was not applicable to him. When Rourke came fully awake, he looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "Still here," he said. His voice was rough from the tube. "Still here. You didn't have to stay." "I know." He looked at the window. Afternoon light this time, actual light. The clouds had broken while he was in surgery, and the day had turned clear and cold, the kind of winter afternoon that was bright without being warm. "What happens next?" "For you." She'd made the decision that morning. She hadn't told anyone yet. But she'd made it, in the clear and unambiguous way that decisions felt when you'd given them enough room. "Harlow General offered me a position," she said. "Clinical Director of Emergency Trauma. Are you taking it?" "Yes." She paused. "And I've agreed to consult for the OIG on cases that require my specific background. A limited engagement, defined scope, not full operational status." He turned his head to look at her. "That's a careful version of coming back." "It's the version I can sustain," she said. "The full version nearly killed me the first time, not physically, the other way." He understood. She could see it in his face. He'd been in the world long enough to know the difference between what the work asked of you professionally and what it asked of you in the parts that didn't get written up in mission reports. "Good boundary," he said. "I thought so." A pause. He closed his eyes for a moment, not sleeping, just resting. "Rex goes to his handler tomorrow." "I know." "He'll be all right. Handler's recovering well. They'll be cleared to work again in a few months." His eyes stayed closed. Rex has been doing the thing where he watches the door. He's been doing that since the trauma bay. "I know." A pause. "I think he understands this is the last leg." She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say about it. Rex was a working dog, and working dogs had the specific quality of knowing when a job was complete, and whatever the job had been, protecting Rourke, finding Claire, staying present through all of it, it had reached its end. That was sad in the particular small way that endings were sad even when they were right. She went to the corridor and sat on the floor next to Rex for a while. He put his head in her lap with the simplicity of an animal who didn't make things complicated when they didn't need to be complicated. She scratched behind his ears, and he exhaled in the slow, complete way of an animal that had been working very hard for a very long time and was finally allowed to stop. "Good dog," she told him. His tail moved. Once. Slow. Chas. The public testimony before the full committee happened 6 weeks later. It was not the controlled environment of the closed session. The room was larger, the cameras were present. The weight of it was different in the way that public things were different from private ones. Not more real, exactly, but more permanent. The record here was not just a federal document. It was something that existed in the world where other people could see it and respond to it and use it to understand what had happened. She was the third witness. Howell had gone first, in an appearance that was the result of his negotiated agreement. The specific uncomfortable spectacle of a man who had built something significant and dismantled it in the same testimony, his voice careful and his posture still military even in the context of what he was admitting. He named Ardell directly and precisely, and at length, the corroborating testimony that Marsh had said they needed. The contractor came second. She didn't know him. He'd been located in Germany, extradited with some difficulty, and his testimony covered the financial mechanics of the procurement manipulation in the specific technical detail that made it impossible to characterize as anything other than what it was. Then Claire. She walked to the table and sat down and looked at the committee. Pratt at the center, Galloway to the right, still wearing the expression of a man who hadn't quite given up on finding a crack. And she told the truth in the order and the shape that Okafor had helped her build. And she answered the questions with the steadiness that had been carrying her since she'd walked into a trauma bay and said 2 words to a dog. The chamber was full. She'd been told it would be, but the reality of it was still something she had to absorb. The gallery, the cameras, the aides and staff along the walls, the specific focused weight of a room full of people watching something they understood was significant. Galloway pushed, in the middle section of her testimony, on the question of her departure from active service, whether it had been coerced, whether the sealed file had been a protection or a silencing. She looked at him and said both. It was both things at once. The people who moved me out of active status did it to protect me from exposure and to protect themselves from the scrutiny my testimony would have brought. Those 2 motivations aren't mutually exclusive. They're how institutional cover works. It's never purely malicious. It's self-protection dressed as procedure. I benefited from the protection, and I was harmed by the silencing, and I spent 4 years as a nurse in Virginia before a dog in a trauma bay made the distinction irrelevant. Galloway didn't follow up. Again, when it was over, she walked out into a corridor where Okafor was waiting, and Tate and Marsh and a small cluster of others who had been part of the last 6 weeks in various capacities. They didn't make a production of it. Marsh shook her hand. Tate nodded in the way he'd been nodding at her since the night she walked out of a tree line with 2 zip-tied shooters and explained what had happened. Okafor said, "Very good," which from Okafor was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation. The cameras were outside. She didn't stop for them. She walked through the building and out a side exit into the cold January air and stood on a sidewalk in Washington while the city moved around her in the ordinary, purposeful way of a city that was always in the middle of something. Her phone buzzed. Peggy Adler. She answered. "I watched the testimony," Peggy said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who was controlling their volume because they were in a public place but would otherwise be speaking at a different register. "I'm at the nurse's station and half the floor is watching on someone's phone." Claire felt something warm move through her chest. "Tell them to get back to work." "I will not." A pause. "Claire, the board announcement went up this morning. Your appointment, clinical director." "I know." Veld came to the nurse's station. Peggy's voice shifted slightly. "He didn't say much. He just said, and I'm going to quote him exactly, 'Tell her the department is ready when she is.'" She stood on the sidewalk in Washington, holding the phone, with the cold air on her face and the noise of the city around her, and let that sit for a moment. Marcus Veld, who had told her to stay in her lane and submitted a 3-page written defense of her competence to the hospital board and called Peggy Adler from his private number to find out if she was safe, and apparently stood at the nurse's station to deliver a message that he couldn't say to her directly because that was who he was, A difficult, honest, complicated man who was also, it turned out, a fair one.
Tell him I'll be there Monday, she said.
She drove back to Fort Callum the next morning. The highway was the same highway she'd been on 6 weeks ago. In the dark, in a convoy that had been coming apart around her, with Rourke on a gurney and Rex at her feet in a situation that had been changing shape faster than she could track it. The same road looked different at 9 in the morning in January light. The trees on either side bare and gray, and the asphalt dry and ordinary. She stopped at a gas station outside the city, bought a coffee that tasted like it had been made several hours ago and drank it anyway because she needed the warmth more than she needed the quality. Stood next to her car in the cold for a few minutes, looking at the landscape. She thought about the 4 years, the specific life she'd built inside them, the lane, the shifts, the patience, the particular pleasure of work that was grounded and present and demanded her full attention without demanding the parts of her that the other work had demanded. She didn't regret the 4 years. She'd needed them in a way that she understood better now, from the other side than she had when she was in them. The 4 years had let her become a person who could walk into a trauma bay without the accumulated weight of operational experience making her something other than present. They'd made her a better nurse, maybe a better human being, though she was cautious about claiming that. What she understood now was that the 4 years had been a chapter, not the whole story. That staying small didn't mean you were safe, only that you were smaller. That the lane she'd constructed wasn't a sanctuary, it was a waiting room. And what she'd been waiting for was the moment when she had enough distance from the thing she'd been to understand it clearly enough to choose whether to go back to it. She'd chosen. Not back to what she'd been. That wasn't available and she didn't want it. But back to the part of herself that the lane hadn't changed, no matter how carefully she'd managed it. The part that Rex had recognized in a trauma bay at 2 in the morning when everyone else in the room was frozen. That part had never gone anywhere. She got back in the car and drove to Harlow General. It was a Tuesday. The parking lot was the same parking lot. The entrance was the same entrance. The smell of the building, that specific blend of antiseptic and coffee and recycled air that she'd been breathing for 8 years, hit her when she came through the door with the quality of something that was entirely familiar and entirely new at the same time. Peggy was at the nurse's station. She looked up and then, with the deliberate restraint of a woman who was not going to make a scene in a professional environment, said, "You look terrible." "Thank you, Peggy."
I mean it in the most affectionate possible way. Peggy came around the desk and stood in front of her. She didn't hug her. That wasn't the shape of their relationship. But she put both hands on Claire's shoulders for a moment in the specific way of someone who needed to confirm that a person was physically present and intact. Then she let go. "The board is waiting for you." "I know. Veld is in trauma bay, too. He has a gunshot wound from last night that he is being unreasonable about, which, that's not my department yet. It will be Monday." "It will be Monday," Claire agreed. She went upstairs to the board meeting. It was formal and genuine in the specific way of institutional apologies, the language careful, the acknowledgement of failure real even when it was delivered in the vocabulary of liability and process. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Judith Harrow, said, "We failed to see you for what you are. This hospital failed you in a significant way over 8 years, and we are sorry." And then she offered the position, with the salary and the authority and the scope that Tate had described weeks ago. Claire accepted. Not because it was owed to her, though it was. Not because she needed to be recognized, though recognition was not the nothing that people who'd never been systematically invisible sometimes assumed it was. She accepted it because the department needed someone who could do the work. And she was someone who could do the work. And that was the cleanest version of the decision she had. Walking out of the boardroom and back down the stairs, she passed the door of Trauma Bay 2 and heard Veld's voice inside, which meant he was treating a patient because Veld treated patients at all hours and in all conditions, and that was the one thing about him that had always been straightforward. She knocked. He looked up from the suture he was running. The patient was unconscious, which meant she wasn't disrupting anything critical. Veld looked at her for a moment. He had the same face he always had, the controlled authority, the precision, but there was something different in it now. Not softened, that wasn't the right word. More like the particular expression of a person who had done something they'd needed to do and had made their peace with having done it. "Monday," he said.
Monday, she said. Day. He went back to the suture. She let the door close and went to the nurse's station and sat down in the chair she'd been sitting in when Peggy came around the corner 6 weeks ago with that look on her face, and she looked at the chart that was sitting on the desk and picked it up and started reading it, because there was always work to do and she was good at the work, and the work was, in the end, the truest thing she knew how to be. She had not fixed everything. The network was documented but not completely dismantled, and Ardell's trial was months away, and the people whose names weren't yet on any fourth page were still operating somewhere in the institutional spaces where people like that operated, and the world was exactly as complicated as it had always been. She had not come through the last 6 weeks unchanged. Her knee would give her trouble for months. The 4 years were behind her in a way they hadn't been before, visible now in their full shape rather than the managed version she'd been carrying. And the quiet, manageable life she'd built had acquired dimensions she hadn't chosen and couldn't return. But she was here, in this building, at this desk, with work to do and a department that was going to be different in a year than it was today, because she was going to make it different. She was known in this hospital in a way she hadn't been known before. Not invisible, not overlooked, not the background competence that got things done without getting credit. That was not a small thing. She wasn't going to pretend it was small. The men who had tried to erase her, Howell with his sealed files, Crow with his self-certain authority, Coulson with his careful, invisible betrayal, had made the same mistake in the end. They'd looked at someone who had chosen a quiet life and decided that the quiet was the person. They'd seen the scrubs and the nurse's station and the 8 years of keeping her head down, and they'd concluded that what they saw was the whole picture. They were wrong. They'd been wrong from the moment Rex put his chin on the mattress and looked at her like she was exactly who she was. That was the thing about deciding to be invisible. It was a choice you could make and unmake. The capability didn't leave when the choice was made, any more than a river stopped being a river when it ran underground for a season. It waited. It moved. It found the necessary moment. She picked up the chart and started reading, and the trauma bay hummed around her with the ordinary noise of a hospital doing what hospitals do. And somewhere in Richmond, a dog with a tactical vest was sleeping at the foot of a recovering handler's bed, and somewhere in Washington, a set of federal charges was moving through a process that would take months and would not be clean and would matter regardless. And Claire Donovan sat at a nurse's station in Fort Callum,